Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone from Daegu, South Korea, where I currently am, to wherever you are in the world. And welcome to Medieval Storytime with the creative Contessa. So I have some very fun readings today, and for the most part, they are actually food-centric. So I hope you all have brought your appetites, late night as it is for many of you. One of the readings is not food related, but it was such an excellent find that I couldn't help but share it with you today. So we've got readings. We've got one of the letters from Alessandra Strozzi, matron and puissant businesswoman and survivor in the turbulent politics of 15th century Florence. We have a reading about a wedding feast that took place in Spain in the 1440s. We have, I'm going to actually, I'm going to read from the cookbook to you. Literally, I'm going to be reading you some medieval recipes because many of you have been asking about medieval food. And so I thought the best way for you to get a really visceral idea of what it is, at least without actually, cooking it yourself or having someone cook it for you, is for me to read to you the recipes from which people like me are working when we are doing medieval cookery. And then I also have another super exciting reading today, an expense account, but it's an expense account that ties in with the letters from Alessandra Strozzi. So we've got a lot of fun planned today for you. So, of course, first question is, audio is great, fantastic. Takeda, it is lovely to see you again. Welcome back, everyone. So let us get right to it. Today's first reading will be a chronicle that is contained in my latest and currently favorite collection of a variety of contemporary primary sources about life in the Middle Ages, a medieval miscellany by Judith Heron. And if you go to I've posted pictures of this very recently, including the ISBN on all of my walls, as posts in all of my platforms, so you can get the information there if you need it. Right. So the good thing, one of the really lovely things about this book, A Medieval Miscellany, is not just the amazing texts that it contains, and it covers texts from a wide variety of eras and geographies all across medieval Europe through almost the 1,000 years that actually the Middle Ages basically encompasses. But it comes with these amazing, it is just a beautiful book. It is just a gorgeously edited book with all sorts of beautiful contemporary imagery, illustrating each of the texts and providing a visual context for everything. So just in the same way medieval books were beautifully illuminated, so too is this medieval miscellany, and the paper is even made to look like parchment. So it really does feel, to a certain extent, like you are actually reading from a medieval book. So I can highly recommend it, A Medieval Miscellany. Today's reading is going to start us off with a wedding feast. And, wedding feasts are ones that are reported on anyway. The card I had marking it, of course, slipped down. The wedding feasts that we have that have been handed down to us in sources are, of course, generally going to be the most splendid wedding feasts. Very few people are going to talk about peasant wedding feasts, although, being said, maybe I'll read this to you next week. There is a fantastic 15th century German poem that depicts, ironically and satirically, a 15th century German country wedding, and that is actually a peasant wedding. And it is everything you would accept a peasant wedding to be: drunken, debauched, breasts popping out of bodices, literally. So that's quite a funny one. I think maybe we'll read that next week as a contrast to the wedding feast that I'm going to be reading to you today. So we're getting started off basically with the idea of food and splendor and sumptuousness. And so this actually all ties in ultimately with kind of the theme of wedding. Actually, now that I think about all the texts we have today, could all be tied back to marriage and weddings, specifically in the Middle Ages. So let's start off first with the setting, the wedding feast. So this is a description of the reception of the Infanta Doña Blanca upon her arrival in Castilla to marry the Infante Don Enrique. Now remember that Infanta and Infante This is basically prince and princess in Spanish, in medieval Spanish, right? So they're the children of the king and the queen, basically. So infante, yes, it seems like a cognate with infant. It's got nothing to do with infancy, I promise you. Okay, so as always, the format is going to be, I will do a complete read through of our selection, and then we will go back through and we will discuss it and analyze it. So if you have questions, I won't be looking at the chat at all during my initial reading. All questions will be taken after the end of each text, after each text is fully read. And I will tell you that this one is not a long text. It's like a paragraph and a half at most. So it will not take us long to get through it, and then we will discuss it and I will take questions. Right. Okay. So the princess, Doña Blanca, her mother, the queen, her brother, the prince Don Carlos, and a retinue of ecclesiastical dignitaries and knights from the kingdoms of Aragon and Navarro also arrived. They continued on the way to Briviesca, where festivities were prepared for them and where all the inhabitants of the town welcomed them with much solemnity. Each of the guilds came out with their banners and their theatrical skits in the best possible fashion, and with great dances, great enjoyment, and happiness. Following them came the Jews with the Torah and the Moors with the Quran, dancing in the manner usually reserved for the entry of kings who came to rule a foreign country. There were also many trumpets, tambourines, drums, and flute players, which made such a great noise that it seemed as if a very large host was coming. On arriving in the town altogether, they accompanied the queen and the princess to the count's palace. There, the important people dismounted and repaired to a place where a collation was prepared, supplied with such a diversity of poultry, meats, fish, delicacies, and fruits that it was a marvelous thing to see. The table and servers were set in a fashion becoming such great ladies, and they were served by knights and gentlemen and by richly dressed pages from the count's household. A tent was set, covered with an elegant tapestry, and there were also tables and servers for Don Alonso, Bishop of Burgos, the prelates, and the four clergymen. The others were also fed abundantly in other tents. The feast lasted for 4 days. In a chamber on the 4th floor of the count's palace, there was a silver fountain pouring out wine, and people took as much of it as they wanted. And I'll show you the illustration that comes with this, which is not of this wedding, but is of a 15th century, first half of the 15th century wedding feast. Okay, so there are so many fantastic details in this. Oh, and actually, I wonder if you can see it. I just noticed something. This is the Maleficent gown. So you all know Maleficent from the Disney rendition of Sleeping Beauty, correct? Yes. You know that high-collared gown she's wearing? Well, I call this the Maleficent. I'm pretty certain this specific dress was the inspiration for the Maleficent gown. You see that collar on that queen? Yeah, I'll see if I can take a picture of that and get that to you. Yeah, so, okay, so there are so many great details contained in this. First off, for those of you who have attended, say, events like Penzic, Society for Creative Anachronism hosted events, or even honestly events, any medieval market that I've ever attended, say in Germany, where everyone sets up all these massive pavilions and we spend days feasting in them, right? Well, honestly, we do that because that's what we can do as modern people trying to have a medieval experience. And I really do think that we're being accidentally authentic when we do that. But here is documentation of tents being set up, pavilions being erected, and specifically to function as communal spaces for feasting, right? So in lieu of a great hall that is big enough to seat everyone, which honestly, if you've ever been to an actually medieval castle, so not a castle that was renovated or expanded after 1500, but a castle that was built before 1500, most of them do not have great halls. The great halls are largish, but they're not large enough to host hundreds of people at a time. And so, in recognition of this fact that medieval spaces were smaller than they might need to be for these great festivities, Medievals came up with a host of ways of compensating for that. One of them, and the simplest, honestly, is in fact to set up pavilions for your diners. And it's funny because we do this for modern weddings too. How many of you have attended a wedding in a rented pavilion, in a giant rented pavilion with tables and chairs and sometimes carpets and flooring installed, right? Yes, that's a modern thing, but it was also a medieval thing. Medieval kings and queens and counts and dukes and duchesses and countesses, they would sometimes, for their great festivities, for their weddings, for their deeds of arms, they would actually build temporary buildings, not just tents. Think about the Field of the Cloth of Gold of Henry VIII. Unfortunately, the only depiction of that postdates the event by 20 or 30 years. But even still, the idea of building a tent city, basically, to provide lodging and communal space, protection from the weather, is absolutely a medieval one. And here it's depicted in living color, right? A tent was set up, covered with an elegant tapestry, and there were also tables and servers for everyone, right? And the others were fed abundantly in other tents. So 4 days of feasting. And this is another difference between the modern idea of a feast or a banquet and the medieval one. We moderns, we think, okay, it's a feast. It's going to last a couple of hours in the evening. No, 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 my friends. No, no, no. A medieval feast, especially in celebration of a grand wedding, was going to take days. And they're not just going to sit on their derriers and get fat for 4 days. There will be dancing and there will be deeds of arms. And then there's some other things they mentioned. So let's go back to the beginning and discuss some of these other details. Ellen, welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. Just if you're enjoying this, don't forget to like and subscribe or follow, depending on the platform on which you're watching this, everyone. So let's go back to the beginning. So they talk about making this procession, right? There's this retinue of ecclesiastical dignitaries and knights from various kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula. And I'd also like to remind you that in 1440, Spain is not Spain. There is no Spain. There's Hispania in the sense of this geographic region that's kind of been vaguely defined since the Roman Empire, the ancient Roman Empire, but there is no Spain as a kingdom yet. This wedding reception takes place in 1440. And so we still have Aragon and Navarro and Castilla and Leon. Actually, Castilla and Leon might have been merged by 1440. I don't remember when Castilla and Leon merged and became Castilla Leon, but it's all separate kingdoms at this point. There is no Spain yet. The Reyes Católicos are just being born kind of in this era. They're not even children really yet. So what we're talking about is a Spain that is not Spain. And all these languages are different. Some of them are mutually intelligible, some of them are not. So for the chronicler, talking about people coming from Aragon and Navarro, those are foreign places, basically. But there's some really interesting details about this retinue. So they get to the town, so they get to this city in Castilla, and the inhabitants of the town have welcomed them. And I wish the original. The only thing I don't like about a medieval miscellany, my only objection as a linguist, is that they do not parallel the original text in the original language. As a translator, I don't trust other people's translations. And so I would prefer to see the original language because I think solemnity might not be quite the right word. Anyway, they welcomed them with a great deal of fanfare is actually, I think, what they're talking about, because theatrical skits are not solemn. For the most part, they're never solemn, not really. Not in celebration of a wedding. You don't celebrate a wedding with solemnity. You celebrate it with joy. Anyway, so it says each of the guilds came out with their banners and their theatrical skits. And this is something, it starts in the 14th century for certain. I'm not certain if it predates that. But it happens all over medieval Europe, not just on the Iberian Peninsula. All over the medieval Europe, guilds basically function like their own, like they do today. They're kind of fraternity. So they're not just an economic thing. They're also a social function in the sense of they play a role in society, in the civic society, and they play a big role. And one part of their responsibility as a guild is to actually contribute to the decoration and entertainment of the city. When something like a wedding comes, when guests of honor come, then the guilds end up frequently footing the bill for that great occasion, for this triumphal procession, for the wedding. But it's part of the way of showing that the guild is wealthy and worth investing in. And of course, it's a display of power, which, people have been displaying power in this manner for literally millennia. So here we've got these theatrical skits. Now, these theatrical skits, this is the origin of theater as we understand it now. Now, granted, yes, in the ancient world they had theater, and I don't know when the theaters shut down in Byzantium. I'm going to assume at least by 1453. Probably the theaters had shut down in Constantinople. But in the rest of Europe, there's this break between the ancient theatrical tradition with like an actual theater and composed plays and all of that. And then eventually theater starts coming back in the form of religious cycle plays depicting scenarios from the Bible, right? So then that kind of gets expanded and expanded upon until it becomes a secular thing again. So by the 15th century, these theatrical skits often would either be staged in a specific square, and each guild sort of had a region of the town where they had to set up. And so as this procession wends its way through the town, they stop and they observe each performance in turn. Sometimes these theatrical skits were actually performed on a float, what we consider a parade float, on a wagon, a stage with wheels, basically. It doesn't say here which version it is, but that's what they mean by theatrical skits. And these theatrical skits were not meant to be, Oscar award winning. They were not supposed to evoke some kind of deeper emotion in the modern sense. They were nearly always allegorical, and they were nearly always targeted to the guest of honor, to make the guest of honor feel particularly special and worshipped and powerful and whatnot. Sometimes, of course, if it was a conquering hero, then perhaps the guilds a conqueror, then the guilds might try to convey some other more subtle meaning, but they would do so at the peril of their necks. So that's what they mean by theatrical skit. This isn't like a three act play with intermissions. It's like a 5 to 10 minute entertainment. Yeah. And in the best possible fashion literally means as richly decked out as possible. Conspicuous consumption for the win. Now, these guilds generally had lots of money, so they could afford to do this, but even if they wanted to go beyond their budget, there was a whole system of pawning property and pawning goods and loans that existed in this era. So often people would go into debt to stage these kinds of entertainments. Wolverine, welcome back. Thank you for joining us. Okay, let me just go check the questions. Let me see. Okay, so continuing on from the skits, it says, with great dances, great enjoyment and happiness. And there we've got the enjoyment and happiness. And that just to me contrasts with solemnity, but whatever. So, these skits, there would be singing as part of these theatrical skits. There would be dancing. So performative, but the performers are usually not professional actors or actresses. That's not really a concept yet. It's kind of evolving, but it's not there yet in the 15th century. It would be the members of the guilds in this case who would be performing and dancing and singing. So yeah. So following the guilds came the Jews with the Torah. Isn't that interesting? And the Moors with the Quran, dancing in the manner usually reserved for the entry of kings who come to rule a foreign country. So what we understand is that here in 1440 in Castilla, the Jews and the Muslims are still a welcome and honored part of the community. And that religious intolerance has actually not set in there, because there are the Jews with the Torah and there are the Muslims with the Quran. So this is before, honestly, unpopular opinion, Isabella and Ferdinand ruined Spain. They set Spain up for a massive fall. They set Spain up for a brain drain, for a wealth drain, for a culture drain. And they, of course, also set them on the path towards incest, like you can't believe, that's literally going to destroy the royal family and literally be eventually the political downfall of the Kingdom of Spain. So, yeah, Spain would be much better off if the Los Reyes Católicos had never lived, is my unpopular opinion. Because of course they're the ones who drive out the Jews and they drive out the Muslims, and with that goes a great deal of scientific knowledge, of cultural richness, of diversity. So yeah, I just love this idea of this. The Infanta Doña Blanca is arriving in Castilla to marry the Infante Don Enrique, and you've got they're being feted, they're being honored, revered by the Jews who are processing with their religious text, the Torah, and the Moors with the Quran. Yeah. And then, so now we get the description of the sound. So this is the part where you need to listen with you need to really listen with your ears and let the auditory center of your brain take flight. So there were also many trumpets and tambourines and drums and flute players, which made such a great noise that it seemed as if a very large host was coming. So host is the word for army. If you ever hear about the heavenly host, that's not a peaceful reference. That's an army of angels, an army of angels. So there's so much sound, these powerful instruments, trumpets, tambourines, drums, right, flutes. These are all very loud instruments. And it creates this cacophony, really, ultimately, that sounds like an army is coming. And that's probably an intentional effect. Yeah. So on arriving in the town all together, they accompanied the queen and the princess to the count's palace. There, they repaired to a place where a collation was prepared and supplied with such diversity of poultry, meats, fishes, delicacies, and fruits. So collation, translation. Yeah, I would smack this translator hard. Collation is not, it's a meal. A meal is what they're trying to say. I'm going to assume that this text was written in either Castellano or in Latin, and they just lazily took a cognate that's not quite right. So this meal has this diversity of diversity because they say that there's multiple kinds of each: poultry, meat, fish, delicacies, and fruits. So someone asked yesterday, I think, or the day before, I think, they had read somewhere that medieval people ate rats and insects and sort of only the dregs of everything, and medieval food was terrible. It was not, my friends, and that's why I'm trying to set us up now with this visual of this feast when we then explore the recipes in more detail, so you can really get a true sense of what medieval dishes were like. And delicacies is, it's a beautifully general word. And often in this era, delicacies meant sweetmeats, which doesn't mean meat at all. Sweetmeats would be what we might consider candy or pastries or confections. Confections actually is better than pastry. So, candied citrus peel, or, dishes, candied confits, which are basically spices like fennel or aniseed that have been coated in sugar. Right? So that's what they mean by delicacies in general. The tables and the servers were set in a fashion becoming such great ladies, and the ladies, they were served by knights and gentlemen and by richly dressed pages. So this brings me back to what I commented last week when we had medieval story time, that the the people doing the serving were not poor, rankless peasants. In this case, this princess, Doña Blanca, right? She is being served by knights and gentlemen, by members of the aristocracy. It is, so everyone is served basically, generally in the Middle Ages, by someone who's one step below them. So here, the Infanta Doña Blanca, she's a princess. She's being served by knights and gentlemen. And again, I wish I had the original language for this text, then I would have a better idea if they translated gentleman correctly, because that idea in modern English doesn't necessarily have the same idea as it does at all, actually, in, say, 15th century English. So they were served by knights and gentlemen in these richly dressed pages. And, so you just can imagine, and actually I don't have to imagine, here, use this picture to help inform you of the general way this would have looked. These are the servers, these are the knights and the gentlemen and the pages there in the center. So a tent, and then we get to the part about the tents being set. And the thing about the tent, they say the tent was set and it was covered with an elegant tapestry. Again, I'm wishing I could get the original language here because covered with can be interpreted in different ways. Was the tapestry on the outside? Was the tapestry on the inside? Did it cover the whole thing? Or did they just hang tapestries on the inside and thus covered with? Also, the word, when you put a word like tapestry in the singular, it might not actually mean one singular tapestry. It might mean a suite of tapestries, as in, like we say carpet. There's a whole carpet covers the whole floor, but it's still one carpet. So yeah, those kinds of linguistic details could help us understand this better. But yeah, so this is the kind of setting I would like you to imagine as we now delve into some amazing recipes from this era, so that you can help, it'll actually flesh out the idea of the kinds of dishes that would have been served at this amazing wedding feast. And this wedding feast, this is another spectacle I would personally love to recreate. So yeah, I would love to actually have the budget to decorate the town in banners and tapestries and have each guild or household performing theatrical skits, and have dancers and trumpeters, and have this massive 4-day feast where you have pavilions set up and there's entertainment. Yeah, I would love to recreate this in its entirety. Let me see. Susan says they didn't mention pork. Was that because of Muslim and Jewish prohibition on pork? That is an interesting question. Actually, they say meats. Meats could, so pork counts under meat. Meat, the general heading of meat could absolutely include pork or not. So you notice they don't mention whether it's venison or beef or mutton or lamb or beaver or pork. They just say meats. So I'm there probably was pork. I'm going, but of course, they would have understood. They would have known that their Jewish and Moorish fellows didn't eat that. So they probably would have been served specialty food. I mean, it's very clear that seems to be an understanding, a cultural understanding at this point in mid 15th century Spain, that there isn't necessarily so well these days. Yeah. So, okay. Any questions about our 1440 wedding feast before we move on to some of the actual recipes that would have been part of this amazing affair? Yeah, I love the idea that events like Penzic, for those of you who have attended Penzic, are accidentally authentic in the way we set up our pavilions and turn them into these communal feast tents, these actual feast tents with furnishings and everything. Even though you don't often see that aspect depicted when you see pavilion encampments in medieval depictions before the Field of the Cloth of Gold, so pre 1500, they usually don't actually show pavilions that are actually big enough for this. But that just shows you that art is not the be all and end all and doesn't necessarily show everything. That's why we need a combination of archaeology, art, and documentary evidence to bring it all together. And in some cases, when the documentary side, you need multiple kinds of art, of documents, to give you a full picture. And I'm going to illustrate that oh so perfectly with the final reading of today. Were the bride and groom married at the church door? So it doesn't say anything about the wedding itself. And I will tell you, like, the actual wedding. And that's because often when when princes and princesses married, or let's say Margaret of York and Charles the Bold, they didn't seem to, there was no ceremony like that. The ceremony was the signing of the contracts, and was her triumphant procession from England, from London, all the way down through Calais and through Burgundian lands, and then her triumphal entries in each of those cities. And then there was a wedding feast, and then eventually they consummated the marriage, and that was it. So this, the idea of grand weddings isn't really weddings aren't what we understand them to be yet. So were they married at the church on the church porch? I don't know. It's interesting how infrequently the wedding ceremony itself is mentioned in these texts. It's like it's not the important part to them. The important part to them is all of the celebration and the power and wealth that comes with the celebratory activities. Um, so, Kendrick, we've just finished a reading from a wedding feast that took place in Castilla in 1440, and it was between the Infanta Doña Blanca and the Infante Don Enrique of Castilla. And so we're talking 1440 Iberian Peninsula. So not War of the Roses. Although the reason you might have heard me talk about England down through Burgundy is I was referencing the wedding festivities surrounding Margaret of York's wedding to marriage to wedding and then marriage to Duke Charles the Bold. Yeah. So that's what we're discussing, Hendrik. Thank you for asking. So we've just finished this text, and now we're going to move on to some, and I promise you're going to enjoy this. Stick with me. We're going to read through some amazing medieval recipes. Marriage, yes, marriage is a sacrament of the church. Weddings are not necessarily part of that sacrament. Understand the difference between, remember, a wedding, you can have a wedding without a wedding ceremony. The contracts were the wedding. And that's part of the problem. That's part of, and this is why when, Richard III tries to delegitimize his nephews, he does so by claiming that his brother had a wedding contract, a betrothal contract with someone else before Elizabeth. And even though there was no ceremony and that marriage was never consummated, he claims that because there was a contract, it counted as him being married. So our modern idea that you have to have this ceremony for a marriage to be a marriage is just not a medieval one. In fact, there were a lot of multiple ways in various parts of medieval Europe where you could be counted as married across all level strata of society. And some of those kinds of marriage were more mutable than others. So yes, marriage is a sacrament of the church. It was actually, I think, if Han is out there, she might be able to confirm this, but I think it was in the 12th century that it was fully confirmed as a sacrament. I know Pope Nicholas I focused on it being a key part of Christian life, but I don't remember if his papal bull makes it an official sacrament or not. So marriages, the wedding ceremony is not necessarily part of that, though. Yeah, it's complicated, right? Nothing can be easy. Welcome to medieval story time with the creative Contessa, where none of the answers are straightforward. Yes, I understand why Socrates was condemned to death. People were tired of him answering questions with more questions and not actually giving any answers. I get it. Okay. If there are any other questions about the reading, about the 1440 wedding in Castilla, just let me know. I can always come back to that. But for now, we're going to move on to some food. Yes, because I did promise, and I will be setting that up for some time this week. I've just got to find the right time on my schedule. I did promise that we would do medieval cooking in a modern kitchen with the Contessa this week as a live stream. So we will be doing that. But I thought I would start off by showing you, whetting your appetites, as it were, by by reading to you some of the amazing recipes that medieval cookbooks contain. And I think a lot of people, so many people have complete misconceptions about medieval cuisine. And my condottiero actually found this hysterical book. And when I get this book in my hands again, I will do some readings from it because it is so snarky and so condescending about medieval food. It has nothing good to say about medieval food. And supposedly this is an academic text written by a proper historian, I think an Oxford professor even, about medieval English cuisine. And he has every pejorative, deleterious thing to say about condescending, insulting, impugning thing to say about medieval cuisine that you can possibly imagine. Yeah. So this recipe that I'm going to read to, I'm going to actually read to you. There's two versions of this recipe. The dish is called a torta parmigiana, which literally means a Parmesan tort, but it's not Parmesan in the sense of Parmesan cheese. It's a torta parmigiana because it is it's from Parma. It's from that Parmigiano, right? It's from the Parmigiano. It's from that region, right? So it is not a question of it being that it has Parmesan cheese in it. It does have cheese, though. It's about where it's from. It's a regional designation, not a cheese designation. But let's talk about what a torta is. So a torta is a kind of pie that can be either with a crust or without a crust. And yes, crustless pies, absolutely a thing in medieval cuisine. And the thing you have to understand about medieval cuisine in general is that what we eat now in the West, in Europe, excluding fusion food, like kind of traditional European cuisine, is la nouvelle cuisine, the new cuisine, the new style of cooking, which arose during Louis XIV's court. And it was actually a regression in cooking on all levels. It was a hyper simplification, a move towards asceticism, a move away from the sumptuous luxury and assertive flavors of cuisine that had existed in Europe for 2,500 years. Well, at least by Louis XIV's era, at least 2,000 years by that point. So that's because Louis XIV, at the end of his life, starts fearing the fires of hell. And so he starts living a more ascetic, a simpler, a more modest, a more humble life. And part of that is him literally ordering his kitchen to start making him peasant food, basically. And as goes Versailles, so goes the rest of the courts of Europe. So not only do the courts start simplifying their food to reflect the luxury food being served at Versailles, then the French Revolution happens, and all of these French cooks who've also in the meanwhile all become masters of la nouvelle cuisine, the Versailles style cooking, they flee France. They flee France because they don't want to have their heads cut off in the terror. And so they end up in everywhere else in Europe opening up restaurants. That's the dawn of restaurants, like not just taverns or inns, but actual proper nice restaurants. Is when all these French cooks flee the French Revolution, and then they set up. They also they of course get appointments at the great households and great palaces and castles all over Europe, all the way into Russia, by the way. And so that's what spreads la nouvelle cuisine for certain everywhere, and that's why all of these amazing dishes with sweet and savory and sour all in one dish, and 10, 12 kinds of amazing exotic spices from Indonesia, right? That all goes away. That all goes away. And instead it's onions and it's garlic and it's butter and it's olive oil and, basic stock. And there's nothing wrong with any of that, but the flavors are basic. Medieval cuisine, if you compare modern Western European cuisine or modern European cuisine to medieval European cuisine is 1,000 times more sophisticated. Yeah. So let me see. What are you? Oh, no, okay. Darn it. When it does that. Okay, so let's go ahead and I'm going to read to you the recipe, same format. I will get through the whole recipe and then we're going to go through the recipe. And I think you're going to be impressed. I think you are. So this comes from a collection of recipes referred to as the Anonymous Tuscan. When we don't know who came up with the collection, if we know where the collection is from, then we identify it by its region. So there it is, the Anonymous Tuscans recipe collection. Torta parmigiana. Take chickens, dismember them, cut them up, and fry them with finely chopped onions in the highest quality pork fat. When the chicken has cooked a while, add abundant spices and salt. Then take aromatic herbs with saffron of the highest quality and finely chop them. Next, take the chicken from the fat and with a knife pulverize it into a paste. And mix it with the herbs and a quantity of grated cheese. Then take some of this mixture, setting some aside, and make ravioli. Next, take some fresh cheese and make white ravioli. Also, take parsley and other aromatic herbs and fresh cheese and make green ravioli. And all these above said things mix with egg. Also, take whole almonds and pound them into a fine paste and divide them into 2 parts. one part mix with spices of the best quality, and the other mix with sugar. And of the one and of the other, make separate ravioli. Next, take eggs and stuff them. Take pork intestines, well washed, and stuff them with good herbs and cheese and boil them well. Take prosciutto crudo and slice it thinly to make a similar sausage. Then beat an egg and mix it with said chicken in a pot and brace it. Stir it with a ladle often. Take it off the fire and season with salt. Next, take good flour and make a crust and form it into the manner of a baking dish or frying pan. Next, with a spoon, take the broth from the chicken and baste the crust. Then, in this crust, place a layer of meat from the chicken, and then a layer of white ravioli with savore over top of it, and then add another layer of prosciutto and sausage cut up. The fourth layer, meat, next a layer of sausage made from pork intestines, the sixth layer, almond ravioli with a layer of dates, and over this, il sapore. Next, sprinkle with abundant spices so that it is covered. Brace it and put on the lid, il testo, as it's called. Open it often and smear with pork fat and close it. Take a fine crust and bathe it in water, break it, and put the hot testo over it. So that's the recipe for one dish, one pie. That is one pie. That is exactly one pie. Everything I just read all goes into one pie. Okay, so there's a second recipe for the same thing, and I'm going to read you this one as well because obviously there's a lot of question marks. There should anyway be a lot of question marks, right? I hope you have question marks because none of that is necessarily clear. But now you're getting the idea about a medieval recipe and how hard they can actually be to work with. Because just like actually, if you think about it with modern recipes assume a lot of prior knowledge. They assume that you know what the basic cooking techniques are. They assume that you know certain steps are just a natural part of the cooking process. And when you are reconstructing these recipes, you then actually have to fill in those blanks. So, recipe the second for torta parmigiana. And the interesting thing is that neither of these recipes come from sources that are Parmesan, that are from Parma. So this one is from the Anonymous Venetians recipe collection. Torta parmigiana for 25 people. One recipe makes enough food for 25 people. Let that sink in. Take 8 pounds of pork and take 12 fresh cheeses and take 6 aged cheeses and 24 eggs and half a pound of spices and 6 chickens and 4 capons, and take the pork and boil it well. And when it is cooked, mix it with a quantity of mint and parsley. Take 6 fresh cheeses and 23 eggs and enough salt pork fat and beat it with the spices and saffron. With these things, make a good pesto battuto and a good giallo. Take 2 fresh cheeses and egg whites and mix and make 9 white ravioli with croste di pasta. And take 2 fresh cheeses and 1 aged cheese, mint and parsley, and beat together and make 12 green ravioli. Take 4 cheeses and cut into thin slices to cover them. Take the chickens and dismember them, and from each part, cut into 2 pieces. Fry them in salt pork fat. Add spices and fry. Again, take 1 pound of pitted and skinned dates, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and put these ravioli in boiling water. When they are done, pulverize sweet spices and put them inside with a crust over. This torta should be yellow and covered with pork fat and heavy with spices. You can make it for fewer or for more people. If you make it in a copper testo, that's a cooking vessel, you will want a small fire. In our terracotta testo, the same. Testo is not a vessel. A testo is basically like an oven lid made out of, in fact, at Penzic, we saw a testo, a replica of an ancient Roman testo. If you go back to my Penzic playlist on YouTube channel, my live streams, when I interview the potter, she made some ancient Roman testi. So you can actually see what that looked like. So a copper testo in this case would actually be a wrought iron dome, basically, or a copper, probably hammered copper dome, the handle on it. And you literally put this over top of the pie, and then you can put coals on it. And here it says you want a small fire because the copper lid keeps ash and everything out of your pie, but still bakes it like a little miniature oven. Because also remember that not every household, in fact, most households did not have ovens in this era. So instead of having a giant oven, you have these testi, these copper testos, right? This in ancient Rome, they were terracotta. And I have seen in medieval versions, I've actually only ever seen bits of not copper, of ceramic ones. I have not actually personally seen extant metal testi, these oven lids, basically. So yeah, so much to take away from this recipe. First off, are there any questions? You may have noticed a couple of things that are very different for modern ravioli. One, tons of spices, lots of very interesting spices: cinnamon, ginger, cloves, sweet spices, which is yet another set of exotic spices imported from Indonesia, basically from Malaysia and Indonesia, modern day Malaysia and Indonesia, and Ceylon, which is not the modern word. Sri Lanka is the modern word. Ceylon was the medieval English word for Sri Lanka, hence why it's called Ceylon cinnamon. So there's a lot of cheese, there's a lot of eggs, there's a lot of different kinds of meat, there's a lot of pork fat involved in this, and there's care and consideration for how it looks, because the different colors are very important. Even though, it talks about making green ravioli, and that is, yes, the herbs will also add flavor, but they'll add beautiful green color. And so when you have all these layers, you've got meat and ravioli and cheese and eggs and more meat and more ravioli, and then it's all crusted. And so when you slice into this, if you manage to do this successfully, because it should actually be all bound together by the cheese that goes on it, you pull out a slice of this thing, it's going to look actually just visually stunning. It's going to be amazing on your plate. There are no currants. Currants are not mentioned, but dates are. There are dates. Both recipes, both versions of the recipe mention dates. I think this one mentioned dates somewhere. Maybe only the one mentions dates. But yeah, the Venetian version of this Parmesan torte contains dates. The Tuscan version does not seem to contain dates, but that could be an accidental oversight. It could be one of those ingredients that they think should be taken for granted. So no, it does have dates. At the very end, it talks about layering dates. So another interesting thing is the almond ravioli, right? Of course, we know meat ravioli. Modernly, we know cheese ravioli, but almond ravioli made with ground almonds, that's completely different. And of course, you might have noticed there's a lot of sugar actually involved in this recipe. And that's what I meant when I said that medieval cuisine is a combination of sweet and savory and sour and spices. It's not, the flavors are just much more complex. So it's not necessarily enough sugar to make it cloyingly sweet, but it is enough to make it somewhat sweet, because it actually gives a quantity here, which is unusual, by the way. A lot of medieval recipes do not give quantities, although it might not have given a quantity of the sugar. It definitely gives a quantity of the sweet spices. It talks about half a pound of sweet spices for one pie for 25 people. Yeah. Mathieu, thank you for coming by and saying hi. I hope to see you again. Okay. Is it true that pie crusts were meant only to hold the food and not to be eaten? Seems wasteful of flour. Question one. Okay, so let me answer that question first, Kendrick. No, it's not true. There were different kinds of crusts. There were crusts that were pretty much only the baking vessel, and that seems to have been a function of a crust provides a different kind of baking than a ceramic um, casserole dish would, or that a metal dish would. Right? So those crusts, the ones that they're talking about that get just tossed, those are just flour and water and salt. And yeah, it's they were not meant to be eaten by the guests. They were often given to the poor who would wait at the kitchen door for scraps from a meal like this. So yeah, those crusts were not necessarily meant to be eaten because they would end up with ash in them, and like some they would actually end up getting burnt a little bit, protecting the inside. So not all pie crusts were meant only to hold the food, but a lot of them were only meant to hold the food. And you see this well into the 17th century. If you look at 17th century Dutch paintings, this still lifes of food, look at the pies, look closely at the pies. You're going to see they didn't slice the pie out. They scooped the insides out and left the crust behind. So that's what's called a raised crust. It's not actually meant to be eaten. And I have one of my household cooks. I don't think I explained to her this concept that the raised crust she's working so hard to get perfect is actually not meant to be eaten. But then there was a fine crust, or a fair crust, as they're sometimes called in English, 15th century English, a fair crust. The fair crusts were made with a lot of butter. Those were meant to be eaten, but those went into a pan. They were not, and they weren't strong enough. They weren't firm enough to actually maintain their shape in the oven the way a raised crust would be, the way a boiled water crust made of water and salt and flour would be. So that's why I say there are two different kinds of crusts. Some of them were literally just meant to be the baking vessel, and others were indeed meant to be eaten. If it's a coffin that's supposed to stand on its own and be the baking vessel, it's not really meant to be eaten. But if it goes in a baking dish, in a casserole dish, and what we would call a pie plate modernly, but they weren't called that in the 15th century, then that's a fair crust that's made with butter and usually egg yolk, and is relatively tender and more flaky and more like what we would expect from a pie crust. Okay, other question. Did medieval people have deep fat fried foods? Yes, medieval people, yes. I will read to you from, I have with me my Neapolitan recipe collection. We're going to go through some of the fritter recipes. They had lots of deep fried food, deep and shallow fried. Lard was generally the oil of choice in most places. But the oil of choice for frying also tied down to what was locally available. So if you had a lot of sheep, then you would use rendered lamb's fat. If you were a cow farming region, cattle raising region, then you would use tallow. If you had an abundance of porcines, of piggies, then it would be pig's lard. But as you see here, the oil that they're using, the fat that they're using is pork lard, and it specifies fine pork lard, which I think means it's been refined so that it's nice and white. Yeah. So yeah, lots of deep fried fritters, pastries, all kinds. They love frying dough. They love fried dough. Every culture throughout all of history, since the advent of cooking and the advent of the agricultural revolution, specifically once we got grains, has some version of deep fried dough. That dates back thousands of years. We have evidence of deep fried dough going back a really long way. Okay, let me see. Mulled ravioli. Yes. When you aqua Athanasios Vitae. When you mulled ravioli was in comment to what? Thank you, Mathieu. Love you for your support. Are there any recipes from Ferrara? Specifically that are literally from the court of Ferrara? I don't know. I can't answer that question. Okay, let me see if I missed any other questions. I did not. Okay, so the thing about this torta parmigiana, it's party food. This is celebratory food. So this is the kind of dish that could have been prepared at that 1440 wedding feast. There were major connections between the Spanish kingdoms and the polities in Italy in the 15th century. Lots of mercantile movements, lots of seconding, ambassadors being sent across the Western Mediterranean all the time. We have lots of evidence of recipes that are international. Like the same recipe appears in the Neapolitan recipe collection, in the anonymous Tuscan, in the anonymous Venetian, in German sources, in French sources, in English sources. So there are absolutely there is absolutely an international undertone to haute cuisine in medieval Europe. So yes, there are also regional specialties, and obviously, you have to, in many cases, what was available locally or what was commonly available locally influenced what you might see more of. But yeah, medieval Europe is highly diverse and highly interconnected. So it is possible that this torta parmigiana could have been served at our feast in 1440. In fact, I'm trying to convince the head cook I have for an event I'm running in 2 months, an immersive event I'm running in 2 months. I'm hoping to convince her to make this, but she might also have a nervous breakdown because there's so much in this recipe that's just not covered in detail. For instance, take chickens, dismember them, cut them up, and fry them with finely chopped onions in the highest quality pork fat. There's highest quality pork fat. Okay, chopped onions, chopped in what way? Chopped to what size? Also, dismember the chickens and cut them up. Cut them up how big? When the chicken is cooked for a while, add abundant spices and salt. Well, what spices? What is abundant? How much salt? Take aromatic herbs with saffron and finely chop them. Again, aromatic. Okay, that's narrows it down. Not at all. Most herbs are aromatic. um, and finely chop them. Finely is relative. My cook just messaged me and said she promises not to have a nervous breakdown. That means she's watching. Oh my God. No, corsets, as most people understand them, don't come around until really the 17th century. They crop up, pairs of bodies crop up at the end of the 16th, very, very end of the 16th century. But I'm very much right now 15th century and Italian, and there are no corsets in this era. Okay, moving on. Take the chicken from the fat and with a knife, pulverize it into a paste. So nothing has been mentioned about the bones. Nothing has been mentioned about the bones, right? It just is, so dismembering could actually mean not just taking it apart, but maybe there it means deboning, but then frying is much easier, honestly, if you leave the bones in terms of managing it. So at some point, it seems that the bones must be removed. And that's been taken for granted here. But that's because you have to remember, just like dance instructions, even like music from this era, the audience is already familiar with the dish. They're already familiar with the dances. They're already familiar with the music. They know how it should look and taste. So the person who wrote this recipe up didn't feel the need to micromanage it, didn't feel the need to specify steps like take the bones out before you pulverize it, because people aren't going to want to chew on, slivers of chicken bone and cut their gums. So obviously somewhere in here you have to make the call. There's certain interpretive calls you have to make here. Well, we're going to take the bones out so that we can take a knife and pulverize this cooked meat into a paste. And that's another big difference between a lot of modern recipes and medieval ones. They almost never talk about ground meat that is something that is raw. They cook it and then they grind it using a knife technique, actually, or in some cases, they even talk about a mortar and pestle. So it's a different kind of mince than what we understand of as ground meat. I've zero evidence that meat grinders existed in this era, any kind of meat grinder, even the hand cranked ones. I have not seen any evidence of actual meat grinders. And the recipes, I can't think of a recipe offhand that talks about grinding raw meat. They all cook the meat first, and then you either shred it or you chop it really finely to make it into really fine bits. Okay, I found a cookbook from the late 18th century, American colonies, and there's a really good recipe for pork pie and for maple beer in it. Ooh, that sounds yummy. Dismember the chickens. They certainly didn't try to make it sound appetizing. Yeah, Gwen, welcome back. Dick, thank you for joining us today. The spiced sweetened ravioli recipes. Reminded me of mulled wine. Yes, aqua. Then yes, absolutely, 100%. Okay, so it says next, mix this chicken that you've pulverized into basically a paste. So I want you to imagine taking a whole chicken, several whole chickens. In fact, as per the next recipe, 6 chickens and 4 capons. So 10 chicken-like things. A capon is a castrated rooster, if you're wondering. 10 chicken-like things, chicken-like bodies, and cook them and fry them and then debone them and then use a knife to turn that cooked flesh into a paste. That's going to be some serious knife work. And that's why kitchens had dozens of people working in them, and each of them had their specialty. There was probably a specialist in this kitchen who just handled the knife work, right? That's all they did. They were basically a human food processor. Then take some of, mix it with herbs and a quantity of grated cheese. Okay, again, the herbs, these are aromatic herbs that you've chopped with the saffron. Okay, still, we're not certain what those aromatic herbs are, nor how much of it, and a quantity of grated cheese. Quantity for the win. So what kind of grated cheese? What grated cheese are we talking? Are we talking, if it's grated, it's probably more aged, but on the other hand, I've seen them talk about grating fresh cheeses too. So what kind of cheese? And yeah, you could say, well, this is the obvious choice is Parmesan cheese. Okay, but now as a redactor of this recipe, I need to go and do some research on cheeses that were actually available, that are documentable to this era. You can't assume that the cheeses we have now necessarily date back that far, because the suites of microbes that we use now might not be the same ones and might not produce the same cheese. And new techniques and methods could have been developed in the meanwhile for making cheese. So you can't make assumptions. And this is the modern medievalist cook's frustration right here, right? The nebulousness of these recipes. Take parsley and other aromatic herbs. Yay for aromatic herbs, and fresh cheese, and make green ravioli. Okay, so fresh cheese. Now, there's some debate about what fresh cheese is. Some people say it's cream cheese. Some people say it's, just the cheese before it is really set and aged. So these are all interpretive calls you have to make. And you might really, if you want to get into the nitty-gritty, you might have to read a lot of other sources that aren't just cookbooks, but also other cookbooks, other recipe collections, to figure out exactly what fresh cheese meant. And this is why a multidisciplinary approach to almost any aspect of medieval material culture is really key, because you will need to call in your experts on the history of dairy, on cheese making, right? Um, you'll need to talk to paleobotanists, for instance, to find out what kind of green herbs would have been common in this part of Italy, and what they might think of were these aromatic herbs in question, right? So it's really is a multidisciplinary approach that you need to take in order to correctly, more authentically interpret these recipes, if you care about that. Obviously, if you're just looking for a medieval shape to use with whatever you happen to have in your kitchen, go for it. Absolutely go for that. Right. Savi, good. It could be something like ricotta, right? That's another kind of fresh cheese, right? A, a, Aditya Terath, I am a medieval living historian, and today is medieval story time. And we are actually reading through a 15th century recipe collection, specifically one recipe for an amazing Italian dish called torta parmigiana. Let me see. That seems odd. Wouldn't carbon have any polishing ability? Oh goodness, I seem to have missed. I seem to have missed some things. Okay, hold on a minute. The gladiators used to drink ash. That's my history fact of the day. So do you feature 15th century historical representation, or do you feature any other areas? I do feature other areas. I'm just fascinated by material culture in general. My specialty is 15th century Western Europe, but I have explored Persia and Turkey, and I'm getting into India as well. And I've done a lot of research into historical Korean fashion and material culture. And I actually am getting into a big research project on medieval and early modern Korean clothing. So yeah, I do feature and discuss other areas and other representation as well. But my specialty and what I have the most of right now is 15th century Europe. Let me see. Soldiers in the American Revolution, all the way up to the Mexican-American War, would use ash from last night's fire to make a toothpaste. Yes, and they did that too in the Middle Ages, and it destroyed the enamel on their teeth. Not good. Did they make food with pulverized pheasant and fish? Yes, also. Not together, but as oh, bloody hell. I hate that does that. Let me see. Carbon is a really good activator, and we use it in filters all the time. It absorbs a lot of particulates like bacteria that forms a plaque on your teeth. Yeah, carbon is a good activator, but the ash, the grit from the ash actually had a deleterious effect on the enamel. So, let me see. Addie? Okay, I will call you Addie. I wonder why they used it in toothpaste. It probably, well, for one, it would clean off the fuzzy feeling, and the carbon, yeah, the carbon has an antibiotic, has antibacterial properties. So, yeah. Okay, so back to our recipe. So yeah, fresh cheese, that could be cream cheese, that could be ricotta, that could just be an unaged cheese. There's lots of options there. So you'll need to maybe find a cheese expert if you want to know more. And then we've got this almond ravioli, right? Take whole almonds and pound them into a fine paste and divide them into two parts. One part mixed with spices of the best quality and the other with sugar. And so you've got these almond ravioli where one is sweetened and the other is just spicy and not sweet. That being said, remember that cinnamon, both cassia and true cinnamon, Ceylon cinnamon, are naturally sweet. So some of those spices would, in fact, add some sweetness to it anyway. So yeah, take pork intestines, well washed, and stuff them with good herbs and cheese and boil them. So this is a sausage recipe, in case you're wondering. That's how sausage is made. Sausage before we had the artificial casings we have now, or the synthetic casings we have now. Intestines were the casing for the sausage. So there's a reason they say well washed. If any of you ever want to do something disgusting, take fresh intestines and milk them and wash them to then use them for sausage making. You heard me right. You get to milk the intestines. It's not fun. It's not fun at all. So you want well-washed intestines, and then you're going to make this delicious herb and cheese sausage. I don't know about you. I would absolutely eat a sausage stuffing or sausage casing stuffed with just herbs and cheese. 100%. That sounds like a great idea, just on its own. And I know you all are probably wanting me now to go get some pork intestines, pig intestines, and wash them on a live stream and then stuff them with cheese and herbs. I know you all want that, and I kind of want that too. And actually, I'm pretty certain I can get help in obtaining fresh pork intestines, but honestly, my current kitchen isn't actually big enough for pork intestines. Pork intestines are really long, and my kitchen's just not that big. Okay. And, then it's, again, good herbs. We don't know what good herbs are, and we don't even know what kind of cheese it is specifically. Right. So, beat an egg and mix it with the said chicken in a pot. So you're actually, come on, Chimmy, come on, baby. Chimmy wants his Chimmy time. I don't know if you all can see. Chimmy's decided he wants me to pay attention to him and not you all. Was the sausage casing eaten or removed? It was eaten, 100%. It's edible. Especially when you boil it, it gets soft. So and it won't taste like anything. Like sausage casing, when it's been clean, it has no taste of its own. It's just literally the vessel for making a dish that is easy to preserve and easy to store and easy to handle for other recipes. And it actually says that later on, just a little bit, it actually talks about cutting up the sausage, into pieces, and then that's what gets layered on. So, the sausage casing is basically like a cooking vessel for the interior, but it's also part of the package. Yeah, basically it's collagen casing. Yeah, bonus cat content. Yeah, but no, I do not train him to do that. He just decides he's going to do that. And he's done. Chimi's my feral rescue baby. When I got him, the people who'd been fostering him had no idea about feral rescue kittens, and he'd just been left alone basically for 2 months. No one had interacted with him, so I had to socialize him and make him trust me and love me. It was easy though with food. It's how you do it. I did it with food. I was successful, as you see. I'm now his human, aren't I? I'm your human, aren't I, Chimi? Yeah, I'm your human. Right. So yeah, the sausage casing would absolutely have been left on and eaten. And yeah, it would have been a good source of a lot of macro and even some micronutrients. Did the German sausage making process is it a result of parallel development? No, sausage seems to be something that crops up across the world. So it's not just Germans. Everyone has sausage. Everywhere. Asians have their own sausage too that predate Western influence. So at some point, somewhere along human evolution, either a bunch of people in different places came to the same realization, or it happened early enough that early humans all realized it. But they realized that the intestines of the pig, or of the sheep, or of the lamb, or the goat could be used for other things. And someone got the bright idea to use it as a cooking vessel, a casing for stuffing and cooking ingredients. Haggis is really just a kind of sausage, honestly, at its heart. Bertus, grüß dich, guten Morgen. Yeah, hi Teeny, hi baby. Yeah, okay, go on, come on. He's a really sweet baby, he is. I think he must have finished his food. Let me see, just so I know. Weisswurst in Germany is made by using the intestines of the animal and then stuffed. It's absolutely wonderful. Yeah, historically, all sausage was made with the intestines of the animal. It's only recent that they've come up with synthetic casings, and it's kind of sad. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, Chimi is a very sweet baby, aren't you, Chimi? Yes. Yeah. So, yeah, we've got the cheese and herb sausages basically that then get sliced and added. Prosciutto crudo literally means raw ham. And again, you're going to have to do some research to figure out what raw ham may have been in Parma in the 14th and 15th century. But it says to slice it thinly to make a similar sausage. So apparently you should take from that you're going to take this sliced raw ham and you're going to stuff intestines casings with it, right? So that's the idea. And so that is actually, it's interesting because it's not ground. It says to slice it. To slice it. Now, what does crudo mean? Raw? Does that just mean not cured? Does that, what does that mean? You'll have to make the call on that too. There's a lot of questions that have to go back into that. Bertus, I'll get to your comment on klumpen in a minute because that's really fascinating. It says then beat an egg and mix it with said chicken in a pot. So the chicken, if you remember, we pulverize that chicken, and we're coming back to the chicken. A lot of things have happened since the chicken. We pulverize the chicken into the paste, and now we're beating an egg and mix it with said chicken in a pot. Now that should actually make it doesn't say whether that pot should be hot. If it is, then obviously you're tempering that egg somehow. Or if it's not hot, then you're preparing it to maybe be added to this torta and then baked, and then the egg becomes a binder. Oh, but here it goes on and it says, stir it with a ladle often and take it off the fire. So there, apparently at some point that pot should have been on the fire. See, all these things that get taken for granted in these recipes. Take it off the fire and season with salt. Great. And then we make our crust. And this is a crust that is very clearly just a water and flour crust, because it says just next take good flour and make a crust and form it in the manner of a baking dish or a frying pan. So it's very much not a fair crust. Oh, Jamie, you're shedding, and now your fur is all over my sweaty face. The tribulations of being a cat servitor. Yeah. So this crust is made with just flour, and it's, again, taken for granted that you know how to make a crust. There's going to be water that's going to help you form it into a crust. Form it in the manner of a baking dish. And now this is interesting. So you form it into this baking dish, into the shape of a baking dish. And then you ladle broth from the chicken into the crust. We don't know how much though. but this is a boiled crust. This broth, because we just cooked it, right? We just cooked this chicken in a pot, supposedly. And apparently, probably some water should have been in that pot also, because nowhere else is there a spot where there could be broth from the chicken, right? So we take broth from the chicken and we baste the crust. So this is a boiled crust, right? You're using this broth to boil this crust, to basically pre-cook it, to parboil it in essence. Um, and then in this crust, but then the other thing about I'm thinking about this, the other thing you have to consider, well, okay, how much broth does it take to baste the crust? Probably the answer is just enough to seal it, to make the crust solid and no longer kind of raw, but not enough that that there's like a puddle of liquid in it. Because it says, then in this crust, place a layer of meat from the chicken, then a layer of the white ravioli with sapore. And sapore is in Italian. That's a word I'd have to research. It's been left in English here. Again, I object when they don't give me the original Italian to these recipes because I don't trust their translation. But anyway, sapore could be a savory herb mixture. You know, we'd have to do some research on it. Probably, hopefully, looking into historical dictionaries of the Italian language, right? Then add another layer of the ham and the sausage cut up. Right? Then the fourth layer is meat. That could be the chicken because earlier it says meat from the chicken. So here it's probably more chicken meat. Then a layer of sausage made from pork intestine. Then a sixth layer is the almond ravioli. On top of that is a layer of dates. Then another over top of that should come more sapore. And then that's all covered with abundant spices. So the whole thing is covered in spices. And then put on the lid. The lid. So the lid in this case, I should explain the lid. The lid is not a crust lid. The lid is a testo. The lid is this oven lid that I mentioned that basically becomes its own mini oven on the hearth, right? So put the testo over top of it, and it says to open it often and baste it with pork fat and then close it again. So the idea is that you're cooking it with no crust on top. So there's no top crust, not yet anyway. And you're basting it frequently with the pork fat to make sure that everything stays nice and moist, that the ravioli don't dry out, because you'll notice there's no broth or anything. So the thing that's keeping this all moist is pork fat, is lard. And it says to open it often and smear it with pork fat and then close it. Okay. Not to say how often, nor does it say at what point the next step should come, because then it says take a fine crust and bathe it in water, break it, and put the hot testo over it. So that could mean that this is you finally at the end put that top crust on it. And it's also a boiled water crust. And then you put that on top, and then you cover it once again with the testo, with this curfew, with this baking bell. So yeah, as you can see, there's a lot of open questions from a recipe like this, which is why it's happy when we have a second one of the same recipe that's different in many ways, because then we can fill in the blanks between each of the two. So this is what's called a concordance. In dance, we do this a lot. We do this concordance process, which means that you have maybe 5 different versions of the same dance, and then you compare them with each other, and where there are holes, you can fill it in. So yeah, Katya, you've got your work cut out for you. Okay, to the comments. Let me see. I'm just going to scroll up. Okay. I'm sorry. Did I stop petting you? Was chicken the most common meat protein at the time? I would say yes to that. Chickens were very abundant and they were easy to raise, and they replenish themselves pretty quickly. And they can replenish themselves in relatively large numbers. Now, granted, medieval hens did not lay eggs anything like the rate of our modern commercial hens. But even still, yeah, it seems like chicken was probably the most common meat of the time. Oh, I hate it when it does this. Let me see. Oh gosh. Bertus, did you use an AI overview? Oh no, don't trust AI. Guys, never scroll past the AI results. The AI results will always sound convincing in an internet search. It will always sound convincing, and it will always be half wrong, at least, if not fully wrong, because all the AI does is scan a multitude of blog posts and websites, everything, including all the garbage that's out there on the internet. And then it compiles it and formulates it in a way that convinces you that it's correct, and it's not. So never ever, please ignore the AI results. Don't trust them. Just don't. Yeah. I don't eat pork, but chicken frankfurters are magnificent. What about beef? I love beef and lamb. Lamb sausage. Oh my God, lamb sausage is the best. Um, so yeah, I mean, sabor means taste, but savore, il sapore, in this context probably means more than taste. Yes, of course, el sabor means taste in modern Spanish, but in the context, you remember when it comes to translation, you have to understand the context of the word, and you have to understand the syntax in which it's being presented and the niche context in which it's being presented, in addition to the general context. So you can never take for granted cognates also, that if in Spanish it's el sabor, that means exactly the same thing as il sapore in 15th century Italian, right? You can never take that for granted. How many languages do I speak? I speak 5 fluently, basically, although I'm really rusty on some of them because I haven't had a chance to actively speak them. But my reading comprehension and my writing are still pretty strong. Foreign European languages: Spanish, French, German, Italian, English. Yeah. Let me see. I mean, I would say Takeda, even north of the Alps, chicken was probably the most common thing, because just everyone had chickens. Everyone had chickens. And you could keep chickens in the town. If you lived in the city, you could still have chickens, for instance. Not everyone can have pigs if they live in the town. Yeah, you're right. Pigeon is also pretty common, but it kind of depends on where you are. Who are you primarily, a reenactor, a historian, both? I am a living historian, Kendrick, is how I would term myself. I study history from the perspective of understanding it and recreating and experimenting, doing experimental archaeology and recreating the aspects that are worth recreating and not the scary parts that aren't worth recreating. So for instance, I don't want to recreate pre antibiotic society. Yeah, I'm definitely a living historian for certain. I don't really do reenactments. Like, literally, I don't do reenactments. I have never attended actual reenactment in the sense of battle of such and such. I attend living history events, but that's different. That's not reenacting a specific moment in time. That's reenacting a specific culture. Yep. Okay. Any questions about the torta parmigiana? So the next thing we're going to read, and possibly the last text for today's medieval story time, we'll see how far we get. So we opened with a wedding, and then we talked about an insane recipe, the torta parmigiana, which within that recipe contained other recipes. I mean, did you realize that? The torta parmigiana itself contained recipes for different kinds of sausage, contained recipes for different kinds of ravioli, somewhat contained a recipe for a crust, right? So one recipe contains recipes for 4 other things. So that's what I mean when I say sometimes to get the answer to a question in one text, you actually have to read many other texts, and the answers will be hidden within them unexpectedly. Unexpectedly. Okay, so next we're going to go to selected letters of Madonna Alessandra Strozzi. So we've read some of her letters before. Alessandra Strozzi is a widow who lives in 15th century Florence, and she lives through a very tumultuous era. And I say that as though Florence has any not tumultuous era before the 18th century. Florence is tumult. Medieval Florence is tumult all the way around. But Alessandra is living through a tumultuous era, and personally tumultuous for her, because her husband and therefore her sons end up on the wrong side of the political strife in the 1430s in Florence. and the men of her family get exiled, and her older sons end up included in that exile later on. It's decided that they should be included in that exile because they are the heirs. And so when they reach the age, an old enough age for it to not be a death sentence, her sons get exiled also, and they end up in Rome and Naples. And so she maintains this amazing correspondence with them because she's back in Florence, managing the business, managing the clan, managing her branch, her cadet branch of the family, um, everything herself. And she is literally going to various political offices and various bureaucratic offices and getting permissions and paying off debts and doing things herself because her sons are gone and her husband is dead and she's a widow. And many of the men of the Strozy clan have been banished, have been exiled from the city. So she maintains this amazingly profuse and prolific correspondence with her sons and with other people. And these letters have actually been preserved. So one of the reasons Florence is one of the most well understood polities in medieval Europe, full stop, is because it has one of the most amazing and well preserved archives of information. So of any of the Italian city states, of all of them, Florence has the most that has survived in their archives, primary sources of all sorts, including these letters. So these letters were written starting in the 1440s and go up to the 1460s. 20 years of letters are preserved, written by this amazing woman who is a mother who loves her sons, incredibly devoted to them. Not much has changed in terms of the Italian mama and and her devotion to her son. And it's very clear here. It's very clear here. Okay, so before I start our first reading, I'm just going to check the comments. I was a good son and called my mother today. No, Bertus. No, Bertus. I wasn't trying to criticize you. Bertus, please don't think I was criticizing you. It was advice and it was a word of warning. The AI results are always garbage. You just assume that they're garbage. You have to scroll past the AI results and get to the actual websites. And here's the other thing. Brief soapbox. Everyone, the internet exists because there was originally a deal between the content creators and their audience that they would get paid for creating the content by having eyeballs on their content, and then they'd have advertisers, and the advertisers would give them money to maintain these websites. You have to understand that content creation takes a poop ton of time, a poop ton. It is not easy to do all this research and then to digest it for you and present it in a manner, write it up cleanly with pictures, or in my case, come up with a presentation. It takes time. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And so people who maintain useful websites, they deserve to be paid. At some point, we all decided we didn't really want to pay directly. So we're paying with our attention to advertisements. But now the AI search engines are circumventing that. They are making it so that website people who run these blogs, video creators like me, our efforts are being purloined and stolen. And we're not seeing any reimbursement or any recompense for that because the AI results mean you're no longer looking at the websites. So please, as a fellow content creator, creating what I think is valuable information, accessible and digestible for a wide array of audiences, I'm begging you, please actually scroll past the AI results and click on the website. Go to the website and read it there. Then at least the creator will get, a couple of micro cents or, 0.1 cent for your eyeballs on their website. Okay, soapbox off. I know this is off topic. Hold on a minute. I know this is off topic, but is it true that animals that broke the law in medieval France were flogged, which was a form of crime and punishment? Oh, you're thinking of the trial of the pig. I'm not certain that's actually true. I think that's an urban legend. Yeah. Can you please leave the names of the books that you are reading from today in a pinned comment or description at the end of your live? Jay, if my condottiero is here, then he will do that, but I don't know if he's here. But remember, I always publish pictures of the books after the fact in either my community post on YouTube or on Facebook or on Instagram. So I will do that, Jay. I promise. I always do. I always do. And you can scroll back through my community posts or my posts on Facebook. over the past several months, and you can see all the books from either the book corner or from Medieval Storytime. Yep, absolutely, 100%. Okay. Yeah, AI is ruining the internet. It literally is. It literally is. So yeah, I'm begging you, please stop using AI. And no, I don't use AI. I don't use AI for research. I don't use AI to do video editing. I don't use AI to write my scripts. I do not use AI voices, and I do not use AI visuals. So yes, I'm not. I've been accused. People lately have been calling me an AI, like here in this live stream. I'm not. I feel like I need to get a pin and prick my finger so you can watch me bleed just to prove that I'm real. Okay, so this book is the Selected Letters of Alessandra Strozzi. Selected Letters of Alessandra Strozzi. And this is actually early on in her correspondence with her exiled sons. So Florence at this point, it's the 1440s. And the Medici are have definitely established themselves as the winners of the political strife that has rocked Florence for like 150 years at this point. They've come out on top, and they are absolutely establishing themselves as the de facto princes of Florence, even though they don't have the title and they pretend not to be. It's an interesting dichotomy. And the Strozzi originally chose the wrong side. Now, Alessandra has spent her widowhood fighting her way out of that. She has spent her widowhood schmoozing, and I don't mean that sexually, just playing the game, which is why we should have lots of respect for Alessandra, right? She's a widow and she's playing this game and she's winning because she's getting concessions for her sons to come back to Florence and visit occasionally. She's reestablishing the company, her family's fortunes. She's reestablishing the business, right? So she is really working her butt off, and she has daughters. And she has natural daughters, by which I mean her husband's bastard children. And she's taking care of all of them. She is amazing. So this letter that I'm about to read to you is particularly fascinating to me and captivating. And I'll tell you why after I read it. Okay. So this letter is about the wedding arrangements, the marriage she has arranged for her daughter, Caterina. Okay. In the name of God. 24 August 1447. Dearest son, in the last few days, I have received your letter of the 16th of July, which I will answer in this one. And first, I must tell you how, by the grace of God, we have arranged a marriage for our Caterina to the son of Parente di Piero Parenti. He's a young man of good birth and abilities, and an only son, rich and 25 years of age. And he has a silk manufacturing business. They take a small part in the government, as a little while ago his father was an office holder in the college. And so I am giving him 1,000 florins of dowry. That is 500 florins that she is due in May 1448 from the fund. And the other 500 I have to give him, made up of cash and trousseau, when she goes to her husband's house, which I believe will be in November, God willing. And this money will be partly yours and partly mine. If I hadn't taken this decision, she wouldn't have been married this year, because he who marries is looking for cash, and I couldn't find anyone who is willing to wait for the dowry until 1448 and the next part in 1450. So I'm giving him this 500 made up of cash and trousseau. The 1450 money will be mine if she lives until then. We've taken this decision for the best because she was 16 and we didn't want to wait any longer to arrange a marriage. And we found that to place her in a nobler family with greater political status would have needed 1,400 or 1,500 florins, which would have ruined both of us. And I'm not sure it would have made the girl any happier, because outside the regime, there's not a great choice. And this is a big problem for us. Everything considered, I decided to settle the girl well and not to take such things into account. I'm sure she'll be as well placed as any girl in Florence, because she'll have a mother and a father-in-law who are only happy making her happy. Oh, and I haven't told you about Marco yet, Caterina's husband. He's always saying to her, If you want anything, ask me for it. When she was betrothed, he ordered a gown of crimson velvet made for her of silk and a surcoat of the same fabric, which is the most beautiful cloth in Florence. He had it made in his workshop, and he had a garland of feathers and pearls made for her, which cost 80 florins. The headdress underneath has 2 strings of pearls, costing 60 florins or more. When she goes out and about, she'll be wearing more than 400 florins on her back. And he also ordered some crimson velvet to be made up into long sleeves lined with marten for her to wear when she goes to her husband's house. And he's having a rose-colored gown made, embroidered with pearls. He feels he can't do enough having things made because she's beautiful, and he wants her to look even more so. There isn't a girl in Florence to compare with her, and she's beautiful in every way, or so many people think. May God give them his grace and good health for a long time, as I wish. About sending Matteo away, Matteo's her youngest son, I wouldn't want to do so for the present, because although he's so little, he keeps me company, and I'd be in a bad way without him, at least at the present time while Caterina is getting ready to go and live with her husband. After that, it seems to me I'll be on my own too much. For the present, I'm not inclined to send him away. If he wants to be good, I'll keep him here. He can't be taxed until he's 16, and he was only 11 in March. I've taken him away from learning arithmetic, and he's now learning to write. I'll put him at the writing desk, and he can stay there this winter. After that, we'll see what he wants to do. May God give him those abilities, which he's going to need. So far as the commune is concerned, I must tell you that I owe them 240 florins, and that I've been persecuted by no less than 4 offices trying to recover money for the commune. For the last 6 months, I've done nothing but go to one office after another. Now, by the grace of God, I've reached an agreement to pay them all up until February, 9 florins a month, or thereabouts. They say the new tax may be imposed for all on October. If they do the right thing by me, as they say they will, not imposing the assessment on widows and orphans, I won't have 2 florins to pay, so perhaps I won't have so many debts. And since the Duke of Milan is dead, they think we won't have to pay so much tax if the King of Aragon doesn't give us trouble, which he's already begun to do close to Montevacchi, at a castle called Cennina. It was said when they took it that it could be retaken in a day because they wouldn't be able to stay there. Well, they've already been there for 3 weeks and look like they're staying because it's in such good countryside. It's said that there is so much grain and goods that they could live off it for a year. It's said that before the Florentines retake it, they will have to spend more than 40,000 florins. May God provide for our needs. Caterina says you should arrange it so that she can get some of that soap. And if there's any good water or anything else in Naples to make her beautiful, she begs you to send it quickly and by a trustworthy person, because otherwise the carrier might do something mischievous with it. Don't be surprised if I don't write often, because I'm very busy arranging everything for Caterina. You'll be paid back when Matteo has learned to write, but don't expect letters from me. However, do write by every messenger, if only to say that you're well and that Niccolò is. I don't know how you're going on with your tasks or whether you're keen to do them. God knows the disappointment I suffered when you couldn't come to Florence while you were at Livorno, because you can say things in person that you can't put in a letter. May it please God to let me see you again safe and well before I die. She lives until the 1460s, in case you're wondering. In the past year, you've made me very unhappy with your bad behavior. Above all, my son, you must behave better and give me comfort instead. You should consider your position and think what Niccolò has done for you, and be worthy to kiss the ground he walks on. And I say this out of love for you, because you have a greater obligation to him than to your father or mother when I think of all he's done for you, which no one else would have done. So do be aware of this, and don't be ungrateful for the kindness he has shown to you and yours, and that you constantly receive from him. I don't want to say any more on the matter. You should understand, because you're no longer a boy. You are 19 in July, which is old enough. Above all, Do be careful with money. You must, because you're in a worse position than you realize. Nothing more for now. May God keep you from harm. I haven't written to Nicolo about Caterina because I know he's heard all about it from Giovanni and Antonio. Remember us to him, and if you're the cashier, act in a way that does you credit and keep a strict tally so that I don't have any more grief than I've already had. Okay, this letter, Lucy, welcome. Bertus, I did not translate this letter as I read. It was the letter on this one. In this case, I can go back to the Italian because this wonderful, and it shouldn't surprise anyone. This is published by Biblioteca Italiana. So it's a bilingual edition. So it has the Italian on one side and in parallel the English translation on the other, which is wonderful because I can go back and look at the Italian then. Yep. Okay. So first off, once through the reading, so much to cover here. Let me go back and look through the comments before we dive right in. Okay. Oh, not so many. Okay. Well, Lucy, thank you so much for joining us. Please like and subscribe, everyone. And if you'd like to support my historical creative endeavors, my living history endeavors of researching, recreating, reliving, teaching, and sharing medieval material culture from across a variety of geographies, consider becoming a patron on Patreon or a channel member which comes with a host of extra perks, such as extra exclusive video access, full-length tutorials on cooking and dancing and sewing, uncut footage, outtakes, extra resources that I share only with my patrons and my channel members. Also, once a month, we do a live Zoom together where we actually interact and you can ask me for advice on your projects and we just socialize. It's like a live stitch. It's a stitch and bitch on Zoom, basically. So if you're interested in any of those extra perks, do consider channel membership or patronage on Patreon. Okay, Nicolo is their uncle. Nicolo is their uncle, right? So basically, Nicolo has taken her sons in Naples and provided them with a home and provided them with safe refuge and is also ostensibly providing them with some kind of employment. But as you can tell from this letter, and it's something that's addressed in previous letters, he's been acting up. So Filippa, her eldest son, yeah, he's been acting up. Okay, so there's so many fun little details in here. First off, we talked, I think 2 days ago, about bride price versus dowry. And so remember I said, if a woman has to come with a dowry, if you have to pay people to take her off your hands, so to say, that means that women are viewed as an economic burden. And so in 15th century Florence, this is absolutely the case. Women are viewed as an economic burden. And that's why they literally have to pay people to take their daughter in. And she actually names a price. She says a nobler family would cost 14 or 1500 florins versus the parenti, who are silk producers of silk, which is still pretty high up on the chain. They only wanted 1,000 plus a trousseau. So we're definitely in the era of women are probably too abundant. There's too many of them, supply and demand. And so they are viewed as being an economic burden, not an economic contributor. So yeah, we're going to start off with that. Talk about 1,000 florins of dowry, 500 and being paid in installments. And one of them is cash, and one of them is a combination of cash and trousseau. Oh, Melissa, thank you. Thank you so for being so generous despite coming in late. Okay, we are discussing the selected letters of Alessandra Strozzi. Alessandra Strozzi is this Florentine widow of the Strozzi clan. She's a cadet branch of the Strozzi clan. By the way, the Palazzo Strozzi is one of the grand palazzi in Florence. You can still go visit it to this day, although it's no longer the home of the Strozzi. But it is in the medieval heart of the city, and it's one of the bigger ones. The Strozzi and the Medici kind of maintained this, how shall I put this, rivalry. And the Medici built their palazzo, and then the Strozzi built a bigger one, right? So this is letters from Alessandra Strozzi, who is a widow in this era. And we just read a letter that talked about, and we're about to go through it bit by bit, that talks about arrangements for her daughter, her 16-year-old daughter, Caterina's marriage to Marco Parenti. And I'd like you to hold that name in mind, Marco Parenti. So we talked about the 500 in cash, and 500 being a combination of cash and trousseau. So people misunderstand what a trousseau is. A trousseau consists of items for the bride's use, so that when the bride comes into the family, she has plenty of goods to support her for the first years of her participation in that family, right? Oh, wow, DW. Thank you so much. Oh, God, thank you, Melissa and DW. That's so generous of you. I really appreciate that. Thank you. So this wedding trousseau is not a dowry like you think of it. It's literally a chest of goods, or chests, plural, of goods, of clothing, of supplies that she will need, cooking equipment, fabric, thread, needles, pins, anything she's going to need to be a successful wife, so that she does not come in and so that they do not have to buy things for her when she joins her husband's family. That's what a trousseau is. So a trousseau does not contain items for the husband. It contains items for the groom. It contains items for the bride. Because again, it's not a question of buying or selling this woman. That's why I'm trying to explain a dowry is not a question of buying or selling. It's a question of financial security. It's a question of financial balance. So it's not the bride is not being bought or sold. It's a question of coming into the family and not being a drain on their finances. That's what it's about. That's what it's about. So we actually have these trousseaux are actually inventoried in Florence's archives. And so we can actually look at these trousseaux, and they're a great resource into medieval Florentine material culture, because they detail everything. They itemize everything in the trousseau and give it a value, because everything was accounted for and it was also taxed. Florence was a big tax place. They had a very sophisticated taxation system. As far as I can tell, they may have invented the tax return. I only say that because I haven't looked at taxation in depth in other places, but Florence seems the most sophisticated of what I have looked at. So this trousseau in this cash dowry are to set Caterina up. Now, it's interesting, the language that she uses in this letter to describe who it is she's chosen helps us understand that it's not about the people being married, it's about their families. Because the phrasing she uses, she says, I've arranged a marriage for our Caterina to the son of Parente di Piero Parenti. He is a young man of good birth. She doesn't name him until 2 or 3 paragraphs later. She doesn't actually use his first name, right? She refers to his parentage. It's his parents, his father and his grandfather, that matters, right? He's the son of Parente, who's the son of Piero Parenti, right? He's a young man of good birth. He's an only son, which means there will be no question about dividing up the estate when his parents die. So this is a consideration, right? He's an only son. That's fantastic. That means that there'll be no economic issues, no financial issues when the parents die. He will inherit the whole estate, hypothetically, right? And he has a silk manufacturing business. And then she talks about things that the family has done, right? His father was an office holder in the college. They have a silk manufacturing business, right? So this is all about the family, the clan. Okay, comments before I scroll up. Okay, when was soap and perfume discovered in medieval Italy? Soap is an interesting one. Soap is imported first. As far as I can tell, it's imported from the Middle East first, and then from Spain, and it's the Moors who as always, it seems to be the Moors, because the Romans and the Greeks used olive oil to clean their skin. They actually would rub their skin in olive oil and then use a strigil or a cloth to wipe it off. And oil is actually a very effective cleaner. It's a very effective cleanser. So you actually don't need soap. And there's different kinds of soap for that purpose. And so we know that at least by here. Now, I don't know when it first, actually, I'm not certain when soap first arrived there, but by the 14th and 15th century, it's an established industry. And that's actually why we call it Castile soap to this day, because soap was first brought up through Castilla, through the Iberian Peninsula, thanks to the Moors. Yeah. Perfume. Again, it depends on what you mean by perfume. If you're talking about distilled perfume, I don't know when the first distilled perfumes came about. Distilling is relatively a new technology in medieval Europe because it comes from Persia, is where it's invented. And then it makes its way across, and then it reaches Europe, I think, by the 13th or 14th century. But I don't know when they actually start distilling perfumes the way we understand that, but they certainly have scented oils. And they're certainly, back to the Romans, they're using perfumes of some kind. So that's been there all along in some form or another. People have been putting scented oils and scented liquids on their bodies for millennia. So that's not an invention in the Middle Ages. That's been there all along. But the smells would be completely different. And Cosmetica Obscura, whom I interviewed at Penzic, they're an artisanal small batch medieval reproduction skincare, ancient and medieval skincare company, right? Two sisters who own it and make all the things by hand. They have researched using original recipes a large number of skin creams, hair oils, body oils, and recreated those smells using original ingredients. And it smells completely different from what modern perfumes do. It's a different kind of set of smells, much spicier, because literally they're using cloves and nutmeg and cinnamon for that purpose. And so this soap that she's talking about that's coming up from Naples is probably Aleppo soap, which is the kind of soap that I purchased from Cosmetica Obscura. And it's made of olive oil and animal fat and laurel berry for the smell. And it's cleansing, but it is not dehydrating. It doesn't strip your skin. Okay. And if you want more details on that, you can go back and watch the recording of the live stream on my YouTube channel from Penzic a couple of weeks ago, where I interview a medieval cosmetics maker. Okay. Oh, I cannot read. Thank you for joining. God, I really appreciate you all. And I want to make it clear. I know not everyone has the finances to support a creator like me, and that's totally fantastic. That's fine. That's great. I appreciate you just being part of my court, as I'm starting to refer to my community, asking questions, sharing your own knowledge, being part of my live chat, making comments, hitting the thumbs up, right? I appreciate all the ways in which you all support me, whether it's directly financial or not. I'm honored by your participation and you're willing to join me on this journey. Yeah, Aleppo soap has been made for an extremely long time, right? Now, I don't know about thousands of years. I say I don't know because, as far as I know, the recipe that's currently being used can only be documented to 1,000 years ago. But I say, as far as I know, I haven't actually done my own research into that. So yeah, Melissa, that's kind of awesome. Oh, 7 soaps. I should have looked at your name, Melissa, more closely. A comment. Very interesting to think of wives in availability and demand perspective. Yeah. So Kelly, I actually addressed this 2 days ago, a week ago, 1,000 years ago. I don't know. Time is moving strangely for me. I addressed this shortly ago, that in the first millennium, after the Justinian plague, there's a shortage of humans in general. And because the Justinian plague kills off 90% of Europe, by the way. I don't know why we don't talk about that great plague when we talk about seismic events that shape history. So after that, there is a real shortage of people and definitely a shortage of women. And so in the first millennium, especially amongst nomadic groups, women have a lot of value. They are valued because they're considered strong and they're expected to be athletic and they're expected to contribute on equal footing with the men in the ways they're better suited to than the men are, right? But still, they do lots of physical work, they produce things, and also they're viewed valuably because women reproduce the species, right? You can have 1 man and 10 women and you can repopulate your tribe. You can't have 1 woman and 10 men and repopulate your tribe. So in the first millennium, this reality is understood. And that's why and the further north you go, the more women seem to be valued. And so that's why if you look at the laws, you can tell whether women are valued or not. And how whether they are considered a contributing member of society or not. So example, fines in Anglo-Saxon England, in Norway, in Sweden, in Denmark, in Ireland, if a in the first millennium, if a woman is injured versus a man being injured, you have to pay a higher fine if you injure the woman versus if you injure the man. If you kill a woman, you have to pay a higher fine, because it's recognized that not only is her economic contribution valuable, but her reproductive contribution is super important as well. So the same thing applies if you have a bride price, which means that the husband's family, the groom's family, has to give her family money. It's not about buying the bride. That's not what a bride price is. It's not about buying the woman. She isn't a slave. She isn't, at least not in many of the automatically, not ipso facto. It's about compensating her family for her economic loss, because now she's not going to be able to help with the family business anymore or help on the farm. So they are losing, in their view, they were losing a valuable part of the family, valuable in a literal sense, not any kind of metaphorical sense, right? So then the shift in women's position in society is reflected in whether it's a bride price or a dowry. And nearly always when you have a dowry, it's because there is a large supply of women and a shorter supply of men, right? And then you actually have to pay people, you have to compensate people to take on the bride so that she is not an economic burden. And this also can be reflected in the way that women may or may not have been expected or allowed to contribute economically to the family, right? So yeah, it is, and it's the same thing, you can look at it, and you can look at it, no one ever looks at it from the inverse, right? So basically, if you've got a bride price, that means that grooms aren't very valuable. So that's also a supply and demand thing, right? If you have too many men and not enough women, then suddenly the men have to provide compensation in order to get a bride. Um, and that's, a bride price is kind of different from a counter dowry, and I'm not going to delve into the complexities of a counter dowry, so please don't ask me to today. Yeah. Okay. Sofen, when I just joined, you mentioned Sweden. Ah, Jonah, welcome. Yeah. So as you know, as I was about to say, in Sweden has historically always been relatively equanimous when it comes to women, right? Women have always, throughout 2000 years of history in Sweden, basically, have always seemed to have more rights and more respect than in other parts of Europe, even through the Middle Ages. Yeah. How similar are Etruscans to Italian civilization? Oh, so we don't know a lot about the Etruscans, right? The Etruscans didn't leave any writing behind, as far as I know. And so we don't know a lot about them, so I couldn't really answer that. Yeah. That's so interesting. I haven't even thought to think about it like that. Yeah, it's telling that the first country that gave women suffrage was Sweden. I mean, actually, it gave everyone suffrage at the same time in 1896. But still, universal suffrage. Women had suffrage in Sweden before they had suffrage anywhere else. Suffrage, for those who don't know, is the right to vote. So I think that's really telling. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So back to, see, I told you, I don't think we're going to have time for any other text other than this one. So back to Katerina. And she talks here about um, she. Everyone is, the men who are looking to get married are looking for cash. That's what they're looking for. They're not looking for land. This is Florence. They want cash. They don't want land. But then there's this really dark part here, and I don't know if you all picked up on this. She says, "So I'm giving him this 500 florins made up of cash and trousseau, and in 1450." The money that I pay will come from my funds if she lives until then. So they've actually broken up this dowry into two parts, not necessarily because they couldn't pay the 1,000 at once, but because there's an acknowledgement that mortality is not particularly high amongst new brides. And why is that? That's because of childbirth. Right? So the idea is, well, we're not going to pay them, to take on a bride who's not going to live for very long. So it's a really dark note but it's very pragmatic, right? I'll pay the other 514.50 if she lives until then. It's an acknowledgement of the reality of being a new bride, of being a new wife, that you are likely to die in childbed. Yeah, go Sweden. Yeah, absolutely. Sweden has so much going for it. Seriously, Sweden, go Sweden. So yeah, that is a reality that is captured by this letter. It's a dark reality. It's a sad reality, but it is a reality. And then she actually mentions something that a lot of people think, that parents didn't actually love their children in the past, especially the higher up in society you went, and that's just not true. And we know that from letters like this. So she actually comments that, we if we'd paid more, we could have gotten her married into a higher ranking family or a greater family. But she says, I'm sure she'll be as well placed as any girl in Florence, because she'll have a mother and father in law who are only happy making her happy, right? She's actually found a family who's going to treat this woman well, her daughter. She's going to treat her daughter well, and so her daughter will be happy. Right? So that is very interesting to note, right? This is important to her, that her daughter actually be well treated and happy. Now, despite the requirement for a dowry for this wedding to take place, there is an interesting note about Marco, the groom, and how generous he is. She actually tells she actually tells Filippo that Marco, her husband, says he's always saying to her, he says it all the time, if you want anything, ask me for it. So she's managed to find Caterina a family where she'll be respected and loved by her in-laws, and she'll be respected and loved and treated generously by her husband. And she cares about that more than finding a higher ranking family. Yeah. Okay. So, comments, questions. The Medici are recorded as having 19 children. Yes, that is true. So it seemed to go one of two ways, Melissa. It seemed to either be that a woman would manage to successfully she would just be a breeder. It sounds crude, but there it is. Some women were strong, they had strong constitutions, and they were breeders, and they were good at it. Yeah. Specifically, Lucrezia de Medici, or excuse me, Clarice Orsini had a lot of children. They didn't all live to adulthood, though. So she did give birth to 19 children. They didn't all live to adulthood, but a lot of them did. So yeah, but that was unusual, right? It seemed to either go one of two ways. It wasn't often that you had one or two children. You either had a whole lot of children or you died early on in childbed. Seems to be the way it went. So would it be safer to have multiple wives, so only one kid each? I mean, yeah, OSU, that's actually yeah, maybe, right? So that there might be something to the idea of the harem, in which you have multiple wives or concubines, and then each of them only have to have one child, and so there's a higher chance of them surviving. Yeah, better for the women, probably. Yeah, actually, now that you say that. I mean, so high mortality, high childbirth mortality. So if it's like 2% now in the United States, it was like 4% then. So it is twice as much, but that's still a lot. That's still a lot. Yeah. Okay, so now I'm going to get to the part that really captivated me, because it triggered something in my memory. The clothing that he bought for her as a new bride to come to his house. When she was betrothed, he ordered a gown of crimson velvet for her made of silk, and a surcoat of the same fabric, which is the most beautiful cloth in Florence. He had it made in his workshop, and he had a garland of feathers and pearls made for her that cost 80 florins. The headdress underneath has 2 strings of pearls costing 60 florins or more. When she goes out, she'll have more than 400 florins on her back. That triggered something instantly in my memory. How many of you have the Herald book, Renaissance Dress in Italy, 1400 to 1500? right? This is a book, if you're interested in clothing, Italian clothing from the 15th century, this is a must-have, right? This is a must-have. And that instantly triggered a memory, because if you all have recalled from recent live streams, when I'm getting dressed, I talk about evidence of actually putting padding in the bodice of the women's gowns, of cotton batting, right? Well, that's from an expense account that is included in the appendix of this book. And lo and behold, my memory was right. The expense account that is in the back of Renaissance dress in Italy, 1400 to 1500, is Marco Parenti's expense accounting for this exact set of clothing that Alessandra describes in this letter that he orders for Caterina. The exact same one, in explicit detail. Every single material described, quantities, value, color, material laid out here. How fascinating is it that we have a letter from 1447 where the mother talks to the son about the clothing that her soon-to-be son-in-law has bought for her daughter. And then here, that expense account has survived and has been published in a completely unrelated book. Just mind blown. So I'm going to check the chat for some comments and questions. And then, because we've just discussed the section on the clothing, I'm going to read to you the materials from the expense account, from the transcribed Italian expense account for the garments that Alessandra describes, so that you can get a full picture of what we're talking about, right? Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? I felt this last night when I was reading through, deciding which ones I wanted to read today, and I stumbled across this letter and I hit that section and I literally got up and jumped up and down screaming with girlish delight. Okay, so first, comments. I wonder how many marriages were happy then. More marriages. So here's the reality. From what I've read from countless primary source accounts, letters, diary entries, I really feel that many marriages were in fact happy, and that respect and affection blossomed between many couples, whether or not it was there to start with. That's my impression, is that life was not so miserable, and it's not a question of, wives being miserable with their husbands and the husbands were happy. No, there seems to be a lot of mutual affection. You can also see that in the effigies, in the tombstones that many husbands had erected for their wives, where they have them placed next to them together holding hands. So my feeling is that just as many marriages were happy and respectful then as we're now, if not more, because there was no onus, there was no expectation of great romance. There was an expectation of respect, there was an expectation of affection, there was an expectation of mutual support. And because both parties came in with that expectation, but without the burden of romantic love, of romance, I think they might have actually been happier in the long run, honestly. We see that in modern times as well. Some women just plop them out, while others need more help and medieval care. Our bodies are very different from each other, but still much the same as women in our past. Yep. Jonah or Jona? Should I pronounce that J as a yo, like in Swedish? Let me know. I absolutely agree 100% that is the case. That, just like now, some women are just meant to breed. They just are. I have friends, they're breeders, man. They're breeders. Susan says Madonna Alessandra was concerned with her husband's natural daughter too. Yeah, absolutely. We read that later on. She's a good mother. She's a good stepmother. Right. And so that also tells us that there wasn't necessarily, the idea of the evil stepmother is just not around here in 15th century Italy. Stepmothers are often recorded as being very generous to not just their stepchildren, but their husbands' bastard children, held with their mistresses and sometimes their servants. Right. So, yeah. Cross-referencing score, delicious, juicy details, just amazing, right? Yeah. This is when I tell people that to understand medieval clothing, you have to read a variety of sources. I have been purchasing collections of correspondence for literally decades at this point, specifically to look for these kinds of details, to corroborate the archaeological record, to corroborate the visual record. Yeah. Trinity for the win. Documentary, visual or iconographic, and archaeological. Yeah. So to calculate taxes and expenses, they would have used some sort of abacus. Yes, Richard, absolutely. The abacus was a highly used implement in this era, 100%. Yep. Okay, so now let us look at this expense account and get into the clothing that we're talking about here. So that gown that she's talking about was actually called a cotta, and in the Italian, it's actually a cotta, C-O-T-T-A, cotta. And the difference between a cotta and a gamora, because I know some of you are going to ask, the cotta in Florence anyway, the cotta is made of more splendid materials. Gamore are made from wool, like always, and maybe possibly linen, although it's harder to tell with that. Cotte are made from silk and velvet and really expensive wool, silk damask, silk velvet, silk satin, taffeta, embroidered, ornately embellished. So that's what a cotta is. Okay, so but it's still the base gown over top of the camicia. So let's talk about the cotta. So for a cotta of zettane velutato di Kermisi, so of of voided velvet, of satin, of so I'm trying to just describe, I'm trying to figure out what the English for this. So zettane velutato di Kermisi. So this is it's velvet silk damask is what it is. It's a satin ground with a velvet pile in a damask pattern dyed in kermes. Kermes is a red louse that makes the what is known as, crimson red. That's where the word crimson comes from. Kermesi, right? Kermes. So it makes that really amazing, stunning red. The richest, most expensive red of the Middle Ages is Kermes. So this cotta is made of this silk damask velvet red. Just imagine that. And I mean red, but like a deep, rich red, not a red that would offend your eyes, but a red that would make you want to look at it and touch it. Right. So for this cotta, 18 L's of this velvet, right? And then it is also lined in taffeta, 20 L's of a red taffeta for the lining. And so what, like this detail alone, so we always ask ourselves, were these gowns lined? Were they not lined? Well, here, this cotta, here's evidence of lining the silk damask velvet in taffeta, right? So it's 18 L's for the outer fabric, 20 L's for the inner fabric, for the lining, and then 10 ounces of bambaja. Bambaja is the cotton batting, right? Is cotton wool. And it's only 10 ounces. So I'm pretty certain that this is enough for the bodice. This is enough to actually pad the bodice to give it that nice rounded, stiffened shape, but it's a soft stiffening. It's not a hard stiffening. But here is evidence that the bodices of women's gowns were worked in the same way that the farsetti, that the men's doublets were worked and given shape, right? And here's a really, really interesting note for this cotta. This is the amazing thing for this cotta. 120 gilt round maglie, which are lacing rings, for the front of the cotta. So 120 lacing rings for the front of the cotta. 120, 60 on each side. And then another 100 little maglie, little lacing rings for the sleeves. And then here's actually laces are actually documented here. 6 points, 6 shapes for laces, for nastri. And then also 26 skins of lettuce, Lettice, fur, a kind of fur, for the filetto, for the edging around the base of the gown, right? So this actually tells us that this gown was not fur lined. The whole thing wasn't lined in fur. It had a fur edging of lettuce on the bottom, right? And it required 26 of the skins. And I forget which weasel lettuce comes from. Lettice, Lettice comes from, but it's a weasel, right? So 26 of these hides to get all the way around for the border around the base of the cota, right? And then there's an entry for paying Bonifacio, an embroiderer, for sewing the pearls onto the sleeves. So again, remember I talk about the division of labor, that the tailor was just in charge, was like the general contractor for the project, but that someone else would do each individual part. So here we have someone else doing the pearls, Bonifacio, handling the pearls. And then someone else, the tailor, is paid to make the garment. So he's like the general contractor, Andrea il Sarto, the tailor, right? And then there's another mention for green and gold fringing to go round the foot of the cota, and for nastri, for lacing, and for cord of silk, right? So the details that you can get from this entry for how to authentically construct a gown, absolutely priceless. And again, that it's mentioned in her letter, and then the expense account, which is not Alessandra. This expense account was not part of her household. This was Marco Parenti's expense account. So these two aren't technically related. And yet here we are. Oh, and L, I'm sorry, Melissa, and ELL is a length of measurement. And depending on where you are, it's more or less than a yard. Measurements in medieval Europe are literally a whole book into and of themselves, because they change. They're not standardized from region to region, and they're not even standardized over time. So ELL, good question. Yep. Okay, I'm going to go and answer some questions now, other than the L. Let me see. It doesn't matter. You can call me Joe if it's easier as well. I understand you're mentioning. No. Yona is fine. I'm a linguist, so I prefer, if I can, to pronounce things correctly. Maybe the ideals have changed just a tad bit over time. Absolutely. Ideals have absolutely changed. Yep. Appreciate that compliment, Joe. Thank you so much. Was period taffeta much different than taffeta today? Nope. It was very similar. Based on the extant taffeta that we have, there's some extant pieces of taffeta in various collections throughout Europe. The V&A has a massive collection of medieval textiles, actually, and the taffeta is pretty much the same. Yeah. Yep. Good question all the way around. So in this case, I'm translating braccia as L, because L is the 15th century English measurement. But, un is the French, AULNE is the French equivalent. And braccia literally means arm. It's the arm length, right? So a braccia, depending on where you are, could be about a yard, or it could be half a yard. It's the measurements all change. Winter coat of a European least weasel. Thank you, Takeda. Thank you for looking that up. I knew it was some kind of weasel. Yeah. So when it comes to fur, what most people don't realize is that animals have a winter. I mean, but you don't think about it, that there's a winter and a summer coat, and that those coats are going to be different colors and different consistencies. And so actually, very often, on some animals, the winter coat was more desirable. On some coats, the summer coat was more desirable. And so they could actually have different values. Yeah. So basically, we know that the cota has 18 L's. So it's, 18, for argument's sake, about 18 yards of fabric. But I would like to remind you that the width of a silk damask, anything in this era, velvet or otherwise, is about half a meter. So it's not very wide. A little bit more, maybe 2/3 of a meter. It's not very wide. So you need many more L's, more braccia of a medieval fabric than you would of its modern equivalent. Yeah. So just keep that in mind. Yep. Okay. So her giornea, which they translate port as a surcoat here, is also described. And remember, Alessandra says he had a surcoat made and a gown made out of the same fabric. And here it is. It says it right there. Por a giornea of zetane velutato di Kermisi. So it's exact same fabric, this silk satin damask velvet, which I think might be called voided velvet in some circles, I think. right? Same fabric. So the giornea is made of the same fabric. The giornea is the overgown, and the giornea is the kind that's open on the sides, usually open on the sides. But in this era, it might not have been, and I'll tell you why I think that in a moment. But it's sleeveless. The giornea is generally should be sleeveless anyway. But it's an overgown. It goes over top of the cotta, and it's very interesting. Normally, they're contrasting fabrics, but in this case, he ordered that the cotta and the giornea be made of the same fabric. So that is very, very interesting. And there's no separate fabric for the sleeves. So the giornea is made, it's even more voluminous, 24.5 ells of this voided silk damask velvet, right? And wow, 30 ells of that taffeta for lining. So the giornea is also lined, so evidence of lining giorneas. And then there's an interlining, and this is interesting, 13 ells of guarnello, which is a kind, we think guarnello is a cotton or a cotton linen blend or linen for lining, but there's only 13, whereas we need 24 ells for the shell fabric, and we need 30 of the taffeta, but we only need 13 of the guarnello. And that's probably because the guarnello was probably woven on a wider loom and was therefore wider, and so you needed about half the amount of guarnello for an interlining that you do of the shell fabric. So we've got the guarnello would have been a kind of humble but practical, pragmatic fabric that would give heft and weight to the shell fabric, whereas the taffeta wouldn't be very heavy, but it would be pretty, so that when you see the turned up hem or the train is carried over the arm, or when the dress flares around while dancing and so you can see the lining, then you see the beautiful silk taffeta of the lining. Yeah. And then the giornea, which normally later on the giornea is open on the sides and open in the front and doesn't have any lacing rings, but here there are 32 maglie bought from a goldsmith. So that's another interesting detail, is that these maglie for the giornea, which will be seen, that's the layer that will be seen by everyone and in public, they have gold maglie, gold lacing rings. They buy them from the goldsmith, whereas the 220 lacing rings for the cotta are gilt, but they are not bought from a goldsmith. And they cost a lot less. They cost a lot less. So yeah, that's because the giornea goes on top. And then here's the crazy thing. 188 skins of lettuce to line the gown and to do a fur border, and to line the sides of the gown as well, to do a border down the sides and around the bottom. 188 hides. And that is worth, yeah, that is a crazy amount of, that is a crazy amount of fur. And then again, a separate entry for the cost of making the giornea paid to Andrea Di Giovanni, the same tailor, the Sarto, who is in charge of assembling all of this. Talk about a crazy gown. I mean, yeah. Now, Alessandra also mentioned the borele, the garland, the padded roll headdress, the ghirlanda, as it's called in 15th century Italian. And this one is pretty damn splendid. It's made of peacock feathers. So it's this padded roll around her head, and it's decorated with peacock feathers and with silver and pearls. Yeah, absolutely amazing. So it's got 500 peacock feathers of the best quality, 300 assorted peacock feathers, 500 peacock feathers of the best quality, 300 assorted peacock feathers. And then it's got red and blue enameled flowers, an entry for Venetian gold leaf, 6 ounces of pearls, 7 large silk flowers, 11 roses made from peacock feathers, and for these and the finishing touches to the Grilanda made by Niccolo di Bastiano, who is paid for that and for the roses a special sum of money. 800 peacock feathers went into making this padded roll headdress. Mind blown. That's a lot of feathers. Yes, it is. Holy God. Now, I know I've got a picture of something very similar to this in this book, and I can show it to you. I apologize. I failed you. I meant to actually have this picture ready to go so you could actually see it, because there are a couple of women depicted wearing these absolutely ornate feathered headdresses, in fact. So you can actually see what it looks like. There's a glossary in this. I wonder if they have it under Ghirlanda with pictures. Yeah, because this Ghirlanda must have been just breathtaking. Imagine 800 peacock feathers, those iridescent peacock feathers catching the light and just absolutely shining. Okay, question. Where did goldsmiths obtain the gold, considering Italy didn't have gold minerals as a natural resource? It's imported. In this era, we think where gold is coming from in this era. It's a good question. I know that gold was definitely being imported from Africa, from the mines in Mali, the great kingdom of Mali, Timbuktu, right? So I know that gold was being imported from there in large quantities. I don't know where else it might have still been coming from in Europe, because I think the gold mines in Spain had been, gold and silver mines in Spain had been tapped out by this point. They had, and by Spain I mean Hispania in the Roman Empire. I think those had been tapped out by this point. There are silver mines in the Czech Republic in this era. I've been to a medieval silver mine in Kutná Hora and actually been into the silver mine, the medieval silver mine. It was terrifying, bad for claustrophobes. So I expect that probably the gold that they were to which they had access was, okay, there were 2 sources. New gold was probably imported from Mali, but they recycled gold all the time. So this is the problem. This is why we don't have a surfeit of historical jewelry, because they would melt down the gold and repurpose the jewels and reset it, because gold was considered a form of jewelry. It was considered fashion. And so as the fashion changed, then new fashions came into effect, and voila, they would melt down that coronet from 300 years ago, that crown from 300 years ago, and fashion a new one. They would melt down that pendant from 100 years ago and fashion a new one. So we actually know that because in wills, actually from England no less, and from France, there is mention of chests that just contain old gold that was specifically collected and amassed, I'm pretty certain, so that it could be upcycled, repurposed into new gold things. So new gold could have been imported from Mali, but they were frequently just recycling gold they already had. Yeah. Yeah, so what year? So we're talking 15th century. So this specifically is the 1440s, 1447 to be exact, to be very precise. This amazing peacock feathered headdress. Yep, pretty impressive. Okay, are there any paintings of her wearing this dress? It sounds fabulous. There are no paintings of her wearing this dress, Caterina, unfortunately. But there are portraits from this era and a little bit later of dresses that are very, very similar, that are very similar in materials. And unfortunately, one of the few things I don't like about this book is that the majority of the pictures are in black and white instead of in color. So here I'll show you. This is a giornea anyway. That is a giornea, the overgown, the light colored, what you might call a tabard dress or surcoat. That's a giornea, right? So that should give you an idea. You can see how full the train is, how long or how full the skirts are, how long the train is, right? So that should give you an idea of, what we're talking about in terms of the gown, the overgown itself. And then the feathered headdress. Fortunately, I can literally see that headdress in my mind's eye. I can see the paintings with it, and I'm not finding them in here. Also not finding the busts of the other women who are wearing better busts, actually. It's definitely in my book of Virtue and Beauty, which was an exhibit in the National Gallery back in 2001, 2002. Yeah. Nope, not going to find it. But at least I was able to show you a giornea to illustrate that particular layer of the garment. Yeah, this ensemble would have been incredible, and it would be even more incredible if we actually found it still in her tomb, all wadded up with her remains. Yeah, that would be pretty amazing. Okay, well this will give you kind of an idea. Yeah, so this is kind of like the kota that would have been made for her, like that. That's what it would have looked like. A little bit, yeah. Okay, so that was a really exciting find for me. that correspondence. Yeah, that correspondence. Okay, back to her letter and examining some of the other very interesting things that they talk about. Specifically, the way she talks about, to remind you, she says, so far as the commune is concerned, I must tell you that I owe them 240 florins and that I've been persecuted by no less, prosecuted probably. I've been pursued. Let me look back at that Italian, persecuted. Goodness gracious. Oh, no. Molestata. Okay. Bothered, harassed. I think harassed might be better. I've been harassed by no less than 4 offices trying to recover money for the commune. So for the last 6 months, I've done nothing but go from one office to another. Now, by the grace of God, I've reached an agreement to pay them all up until February, 9 florins a month or thereabouts. So what's interesting about this is that a lot of a lot of people think, especially in Italy and Florence, that women just stayed at home. The ladies stayed at home. They didn't go out and about. They didn't do anything. She literally says, I have spent the last 6 months doing nothing but going from one office to another, and I've reached an agreement. So here's this widow. Her sons are exiled. She basically has no menfolk left at home except for an 11-year-old son. And she is going and negotiating and haggling and making deals and doing it all herself, right? While running a household. So I just have to say that's really impressive. That is really super impressive. There's another interesting comment here. She meet my cat who came up and made me pet him. Now I've got fur all over my face. There's another interesting comment here. It's a reference to history, actually, to a greater history that's happening. And it's this kind of war that's ongoing. And so letters like this are valuable sources for the general study of history. And this is why I tell people history is not set in stone, because we might think we understand a specific episode in history, and then we find a new source that casts new light on it. So here she talks about, they say the new tax may be imposed for all in November, but if they do the right thing by me, that they say they will not impose the assessment on me because I'm a widow, nor will they impose it on my son because he's an orphan because his father is dead. So I won't have to pay the 2 florins. So maybe I won't have many debts. And then she says, and since the Duke of Milan is dead, such a casual mention, right? They think we, the city, won't have to pay so much tribute, actually, as long as the King of Aragon does not give us trouble. So the King of Aragon at this point is also the King of Naples, which he's already begun to do close to Montevecchi at a castle called Cennina. And then she talks about that, it was assumed that when the King of Aragon took up, when his forces took up residence there, that they wouldn't be able to hold out for very long, because it sounds like Florence is now trying to keep them out by sieging them, right? But now it sounds like it says there's so much, the countryside is so good There's so much grain and goods that they could live off of it for a year. So if the Florentines want to take that castle back, they're going to have to spend more than 40,000 florins to do so, because they're not doing the fighting themselves, ladies and gentlemen. The Florentines were not fighters, generally. They were happy to pay condottiere to fight their wars for them. And so the amount that they've probably been quoted by condottieri, by the knightly mercenaries of 15th century Italy, was 40,000. Basically, they probably reached out to, I don't know which one, could have been one of the Malatesta condottieris. It could have been, it could have been Leonello d'Este, right? To his cadre of condottieri. They probably asked them, they said, hey, we want to retake this castle. How much do you think it will cost? And they probably got a quote about 40,000 florins. Okay, comments. Okay, to the comments section. Oh, thank you all. Thank you all for joining me in this exploration. Sorry, this thing is making it tricky for me. Okay, it must have been a daunting task for her, considering women in those days were looked down upon because of the lack of power. Or am I wrong? So, Richard, yeah, women in 15th century Florence, it doesn't really seem that they were so looked down upon, actually. It seems like they were given respect and they were valued in a certain way. It might not necessarily be quite the same as today, but nevertheless, I'm certain it was daunting because she is representing a fallen family. She is representing a family that has in the last decade or so been politically disgraced, and she's trying to rebuild that. So that aspect is almost more daunting than anything. But I think it's telling that she was able to go to all those offices and achieve all that. So I think that alone tells us that women were maybe not as downtrodden as we might think they were in 15th century Florence. I'm not saying it was a picnic. I'm not saying that they had all the rights that Florentine women have now. They didn't, but actually, not all men had all the rights that Florentine men have now, to be honest. No, that's a really good question. Appreciate that. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that is Alessandra's letter, where she talks about so many things, and she is very profuse. You might have noticed the letter kind of rambles, and that's because she doesn't sit down and write it at once. That's not how medieval or historical letter writing worked. She would start a letter and share some information, and then she would come back to it with new information, and then come back to it with more new information. So her letters absolutely ramble, but they contain all sorts of little gems, including macro history, right? Macro European history on a greater scale than just her own family's life and her experiences in Florence. So, and that's evidence of how the women were there and watching and observing and noting, and how they were sharing information beyond the walls of Florence, right? So here's this widow of an exiled, banished family, and she's getting out there and chatting and talking and hearing and sharing information. Yeah. So it's this shows this shows how women found ways to have power even in systems that might have denied it to them hypothetically. As Yona says, it's still not a picnic being a woman. Yeah, I said this, Yona, I said this yesterday, and I said this the day before. Everyone assumes that everything here, we've achieved equality, just like we're in a post-racist era. We are not, and we have not. In many places in the world, you are still a second-class citizen if you're a woman. If you're not a third-class citizen, sex trafficking is still happening. And in many states in the US, women's rights have been rolled back literally decades to, in some cases, to a state in which women, to a more rightless, a more disenfranchised state than women have maybe ever been in the United States' history, which should tell you something. Okay, any questions about Alessandra, her letters, anything we discussed, the clothing? Otherwise, that is what I have for you today, ladies and gentlemen. I'll go ahead and give you a chance to ask any final questions or make any final comments. Otherwise, I would once again like to thank my generous super chatters, those who've basically tipped me through the super chats, for my channel members, for my patrons, For those of you who are part of my community, I would also like to remind you that one of my channel sponsors, well, other than my patrons and my channel members, one of my channel sponsors is the wonderful Armor and Castings. And some of you asked about this pendant because it went missing at Fenzik. It fell off of my neck. It fell off of my neck, if you recall. This amazing, gorgeous pendant, replica pendant belonging to Mary of Burgundy. You see this thing, and Margaret of York, right? It was found. It was turned in. It was found and it was turned into Lost and Found. So it is back. So yeah, this amazing piece by Armor and Castings. You can purchase this from their website, armorandcastings.com. Contessa 10 will get you an extra 10% off. I love this thing. It makes a great necklace for the Italian purposes. You can also pin it to your fillet, right? I have a whole little video about how to wear these things. So some of you are asking me about this. It's back. Once more reunited with me. I'm so happy. Yeah. Right. So this book, I would check. I bought this book a long time ago. So I would check with Abe Books would be the first place I would go. I would go to Abe Books, and then I would go to Barnes and Noble. Please don't support Amazon if you don't have to. They're terrible. They are a terrible company and a terrible employer, and they treat their vendors terribly. Yeah, and they're literally destroying the middle class and destroying small businesses and not necessarily getting us actually better quality. So yeah, you can tell that Amazon is not a sponsor of this channel. Yeah. Alessandra, select it. If you scroll up in the live chat, you should be able to see the details for this book. And as always, after the live stream, I will post pictures of the front and the back with the ISBN of the books from today's medieval story time. Yep. Okay, otherwise, any final questions or comments? If you're watching this as a recording, or if something occurs to you later, you can just pop the comment in the chat. Oh, for my channel members and my patrons, I also have a Discord. I will repost that in the members only. I will post that link once again, both on Patreon and on the members only community posts on YouTube. So if you want to join our Discord, feel free to join us. We have a small Discord, but I think it's a pretty good one with a lot of good information getting shared around. So yeah. Otherwise, I thank you all so much for joining me today. I'm going to go ahead and schedule that medieval story time. I might have to reschedule today's medieval sewing party. That's in 3 hours because this took longer than I was expecting, and that's fine. So I might be rescheduling, and I'll be having an afternoon medieval sewing party later on this week. I'm definitely rescheduling the one from today because I need to do some cooking and cleaning around the house. And otherwise, thank you all for joining me on this journey of exploration and exploring the beautiful and sometimes the not so beautiful corners of medieval history. Until next time, everyone, remember to like and subscribe, and may your adventures be creative. Bye, everyone.